Authority to check. All right, hello everybody. I'm going to go ahead and do a voice check for those of you out there on Zoom. You can hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you, and I can hear you perfect. And with that, I'll go ahead and call the November 15th, 2021 Design Review Committee meeting to order at 3 p.m. And for the record, I can see that committee members Gresham and Hurd are in attendance, and I do not see committee member Labrie. Also for the record, planning official Thornborrow is in attendance, as well as planner Hanna Veal. And we do have quorum. For those members who are in attendance, are there any changes to the agenda? I'm seeing none, and by staff neither, so none. And the next item on the agenda is the consent agenda consisting of the November 1st, 2021 minutes.
I hate to say this without Brett here, but I can vote on this because it includes the minutes and I wasn't there.
And then we can continue those to the next item or to the next meeting. And then the next item is a public hearing for subdivision fiscal year 2021, number 8 for Torn Plat subdivision. And is the applicant available or online? I think we can push this item to after toward down the agenda to see if the applicant comes, and we can skip down to the pre-application discussion. And I am not seeing that applicant online either. So with that, let's take it down to the discussion related to CPA fiscal year 2021, number 1. Hanna Ball requesting a potential code amendment to Garden City Code to allow for tiny home community. It's staff's understanding that this code amendment's intended to specifically allow for tiny homes on wheels with the intent to address affordability. During the pre-application meeting with the applicant that's required prior to submittal, staff's largest concerns related to ensuring that there are safety standards that are in place and legal authority, if there is legal authority related to for the city to approve something like this per Idaho Code 49-119. And the city attorney is here and he did write a memorandum and he can get into that. And then I'll turn it over to him. And then I'll just cherry, after we turn it over to him, I'll cherry pick some of the items that staff addressed in the report and open it up for a discussion with this following committee.
Thanks, Ms. Thornborrow. Committee members, I was asked to look at tiny homes, specifically what we call tiny homes on wheels, which are loosely defined as recreational vehicles. And so the issue is, and as I understand it, and I looked at a high level, I haven't looked at all the details, but I was asked to just look at the legal issues. The legal issues I see is I think there are going to be some complications or some difficulties trying to get used tiny home on wheels for permanent dwelling for permanent residence. I've looked at all the legal issues, and I don't want to bore everybody with the legal issues unless I have specific questions, but there are several jurisdictions in Idaho that do allow for tiny homes. Boise is one, Wilder is one, I believe, and then Moscow is one. Boise requires that they be on a foundation, and so that's not this proposal. I think it's Wilder, let me check. Wilder requires that they be not on wheels, which is not this proposal. The only jurisdiction in Idaho that I found where they do allow tiny homes on wheels, or THOWs, to be lived in permanently is in Moscow, and they only allow those in mobile home parks or recreational parks. The reason I think that jurisdictions do not allow what's proposed do not allow those, in residential districts, and it looks like this is for a couple of residential districts, is because, and this is where it gets complicated, the definition of recreational vehicle, so on and so forth. And I'm happy to answer any of those questions. But my bottom line is, I think there's going to be some legal challenges and some logistical challenges. I think there's a reason why, and I'm sure the applicant could correct me. I know the applicant and her team has probably researched this more than I have. So if I'm wrong, I would stand to be corrected. But the only jurisdiction I found in Idaho that even closely resembles what's proposed here is up in Moscow. And they don't allow those just in whatever residential district. It's my read, and I just read it quickly, but my read is they only allow those for RV parks or mobile home parks. And my understanding is that is not what this proposal is. So I see some logistical and some legal difficulties with this proposal. And I have a memo, and I'm focusing, for anybody that wants to look at my memo, page 3 of my memo, I say there's a strong argument to be made that because the legislature deleted human habitation from the definition of an RV, that they don't want, RVs are not to be used for human habitation. And because if you want to use them for human habitation then you still have to comply with all the life safety requirements in the code. That would be electrical, plumbing, and an HVAC, I think. So I just, I haven't looked at this in detail. I was asked to come down here this morning, and I'm happy to do that. But I just see that there's going to be some difficulties with this going forward. Maybe the applicant has a workaround, I'm not sure, but I do see some difficulties in this application. So with that, I'd stand for any questions. Thank you.
Charlie, I know you've just looked at this briefly, but do you know if Moscow is addressing any sort of certification on their tiny homes on wheels, as far as it's certified as an RV even?
Well, that's where a committee member Hurd, that's where it gets complicated. The ordinance in Moscow, from Moscow, and I just printed it. Here's City of Wilder. I have City of Moscow is 22 pages, their ordinance, and it's pretty complicated. But my read was, and I don't know if this is really answering your question, my read is that they were only allowed in mobile home parks and RV parks. There is that certification process that you went through. And I don't know, I honestly don't know the answer to your question, committee member Hurd. Sorry.
Okay,
I might,
thanks.
with a question that I asked the state. I did reach out to Division of Building Safety, and they have a brochure that talks or speaks to tiny homes that I can certainly provide to the committee and make part of the record. But it does note that it needs to be reviewed under one of the 3 provisions. So either HUD, the IDC or IRC, so building code, HUD, or the RVIA standards for RVs.
And I will point out, we've done some preliminary research. One of the things that we looked at is the Department of Building Safety. They have a 2-page flyer. You can find it on the web. And it says, quote, "For a tiny house classified as an RV, you may have challenges in obtaining planning and zoning approval," end of quote. And I think that's true here, based on what the proposal is. It's, RVs are not supposed to be used for human habitation. And so, they can get around, RVs can get around some of local regulation if they comply with the National Fire Protection Association Rule 1192, NFPA Rule 1192. But that's not, I just don't know how we can get there in this situation. As I understand it, the proposal is to allow RVs to be in residential zones and for people to live in them permanently. If it was going to be temporary, that's one thing, but for them to be permanent, that's where we're going to run into problems, I believe. And again, I just want to put a caveat out there that to the applicant that my review is not complete. Perhaps Ms. Ball knows something that I don't, but based on my cursory review, this is where I'm at. So thank you.
All right, and I might just bring in, put Ms. Ball on the spot there. Have you contemplated that? Do you have a workaround, as Mr. Wadhams has noted that you need?
I think we have some conversations or some bullet points that could further the discussions. Sorry, Jenna, are you saying it's my turn to go up?
Well, just on that specific point related to Idaho statute 49-119 that notes that RVs cannot provide permanent housing.
Sure.
And a proposal to utilize or to propose code for RVs rather than HUD standards or building stick-built standards.
Sure. So I do. Most importantly, most specifically, what's the timeline, or I would ask, what's the timeline or classifications where something goes from temporary to permanent in nature as far as Garden City Code? Is there any middle grounds for semi-permanent?
I guess it's related to Garden City Code. It's 90 days for temporary uses.
So temporary living is considered 90 days.
Well, temporary uses per Garden City Code. There's nothing in Garden City Code that specifically addresses temporary living that I'm aware of.
Okay, so I think what I'm hearing is RVs can't be lived in permanently, but could they be lived in temporarily? And so the question is, yes, for X period of time. Is that correct?
Garden City Code has a restriction outside of RV parks for 14 days.
Okay, so outside of an RV park, it's 14 days. And so inside an RV park, what do you know that timeline?
And that is 90 days.
And so Jenna, where do you see that 90 days at?
E2C33 recreational vehicle park.
Okay, so in this proposal, we would still be considering to create a park in nature. So we have said we want to establish a park. And from what we have seen is nothing in Idaho code would not allow the cities to modify their own timelines. so to speak. So even though it's established at 90 days right now, the city could say it could be 6 months, it could be 1 year. The city is authorized to make those timelines. Is that correct?
I will actually defer to the city attorney if he's aware of anything in Idaho code that would preclude modification.
You know, and here's a caveat. I will, by the time this is in front of planning and zoning or city council, I will be more up to speed on this. But I would point everybody again to the words of human habitation. I don't know what the definition of human habitation is, but the code, Idaho Code 49-119 says that RVs are not used for human habitation. So what does human habitation mean? I don't know. I guess we all collectively try to find out what a definition of human habitation is. I would say human habitation definitely includes permanent residence. But I don't know if human habitation is 90 days, 6 months, 1 year. I do not have an answer for that today, unfortunately.
Gotcha. So, so even with, some outstanding questions, I still kind of wanted to go through our pieces of information that we found, and specifically how we know today that human habitation is occurring in RVs. We know that RV parks are established, not in Garden City, but throughout Idaho. And so I think there's a lot of, and we know that the cities have the authority to create sideboards as to what their timelines to create a tiny house park could be.
And just, I can see the committee member Labrie is on in the meeting as well, and just to show. And we are currently in the discussion related to CPA fiscal year 2021 number 1.
So if I could, and I know this is a more informal setting than what I'm used to, so I hope I'm not talking out of school or anything, but I would, if you look at the city of Wilder, their definition of tiny home is a non-mobile residential dwelling, so on and so forth. So in Wilder, it's non-mobile residential dwelling, which distinguishes from what I understand we're looking at today. If you look at the city of Boise's website, they specifically say tiny houses need to be on a permanent foundation. And I'm sure there's a reason for that. And then if you look at the Moscow ordinance, and it's ordinance 220-1, so it's a 2020 ordinance, it just starts talking about how tiny, and what I would call tiny home on wheels, but they don't use that term, but they say, my interpretation, my read is those can be allowed in manufactured home parks for with longer than 6 months, or in RV parks. So again, Moscow does allow them, but only in real narrow situations. And so I heard that Coeur d'Alene may have an ordinance on tiny homes, and I'm sure Mr. Jones or Ms. Ball would know that. But my review to date, I've only found these 3 jurisdictions. So thank you.
Hey, Charlie, can I ask a couple of questions?
Yes, sir. I mean, if it's okay with our chair here. Yeah.
So I think, what we're looking at and thinking is that, we don't see tiny homes as built like RVs. So I think there's a clear difference. People can look at a tiny home and understand that's a tiny home versus an RV. They're constructed differently. And I think, in our mind, there's some ground in between the really temporariness of an RV and maybe a fully permanent foundationed home. So I think tiny homes are kind of in this grayer area between that, which is what the city of Moscow found, which is that they're basically saying, hey, you can put them in these mobile home parks. You could also put them in RV parks. And I think what we're kind of looking at is that the zonings that we've looked at are the zonings where our mobile home parks exist right now, and where RV parks are allowed to exist, which is that C2 zone. And so I think that's what we're kind of saying is, hey, they're still not going to be permanent because they won't be foundationed. So from the permanent point of view, by keeping them on wheels, we're saying, look, they're not permanent. But what we see is that they're also not just RVs. They can definitely be distinguished from RVs. And so I guess the question is, since Idaho law is kind of in a gray area behind the time there's no actual definition of tiny houses yet for the state of Idaho. The real question is, how can Garden City kind of legalize something that I think everybody recognizes that it's cooler than an RV. Like the tiny homes that Hanna has had parked out on her lot have drawn a lot of attention. So as we've gone out and shown people the tiny homes, they're interested. If we had just parked some RVs out there, nobody'd be coming over to look. And so I think there's that clear difference in that, there's TV shows about tiny homes and people living in them, and there's not TV shows about all the people who live at the fairgrounds in RVs. And I think so there's some, like I said, this kind of gray area because they really are more permanent than RVs, but not permanent because they're still not going to be on foundations. And so I guess my question, I know you're pointing out that like Moscow says, hey, they can only be in mobile home parks, but I think we're kind of saying the same thing with this code change, which is we put them into the two zones where those are actually allowed already and said, hey, we're going to zone so that we can have a little tiny home community, if you will. And so I guess the question is, I want to make sure we're at least, in my mind, we're creating a code that covers the bases of health, safety, welfare, and at the same time is amenable to the neighbors so that, I think we've looked at the density specifically to make sure that what we're building doesn't end up being negatively viewed, if you will.
Well, so can I ask a question? And again, if this is too informal, somebody just tell me to shut up, but okay, it's a discussion. Okay, tiny home on wheels. They must, what I read and I believe to be true is that tiny homes on wheels must comply with NFPA 1192 if they want exemption from local laws regarding plumbing, heating, and electrical. So would these tiny home on wheels, would they comply with NFPA 1192?
Yeah, I believe so.
And then so that way they'd be exempt from the local plumbing, heating, and electrical regulations.
Yeah, and so just to give you a little bit of background that we know that I think you wouldn't know unless you had studied it a bunch, but like most of the builders who are local, so like Tiny Idaho Homes, for example, they're actually certifying theirs RVIA. And so again, while they're certifying it RVIA, the reason they're doing that is so that they're actually allowed at RV parks. So they're building it to that code so that they can actually have a place to go, because right now, because again, Idaho's in this gray area, the tiny homes really can't exist almost anywhere in Idaho unless cities start to look at it and go, hey, where can we allow these to be? So right now, almost all of the ones that are being built are being certified in some way or the other. So I would say the majority of the ones that I see are RVIA certified. And so they are meeting RV code. And so technically they are classified as RVs. But again, I think that it's that's being done because there is no other route for them to be able to legally exist anywhere.
And if I could ask another question, are you aware of any jurisdictions that currently allow for something like this? What I've seen, the answer is no, but I mean, are there in Idaho or outside of Idaho, are these allowed as proposed?
Yes. So I think what Hanna and I have seen is that outside of Idaho, all over is the answer. I mean, all of California now has it, like every major city has it in California. Portland has now allowed them everywhere in every zone. We just were looking at a tiny house community in Dallas, Texas, that is an actual kind of similar to what we're doing, which is actually a community model where you can have multiple tiny homes. So like in Portland, they're allowing them as ADUs, as just the accessory dwelling. And they still allow the communities too, because there are some tiny home communities in Portland, but the newest revelation there was that they just allow them everywhere now as ADUs. But I think, like I said, similar to what we're doing, Dallas, Texas has one that's just recently opened in the last couple of years. That's kind of that same model where they're all on wheels. And so I think that's kind of what we're looking at. But in Idaho, Moscow, as far as I know, Moscow is the only place that's allowed them on wheels. And I know that we've communicated. So we did communicate with Macy Miller, who is the one that helped Moscow write their code for the tiny house on wheels there. So we could always bring her in to be part of one of these work sessions if we need a little more input.
And the city attorney up there is Mia Bautista. I'm sure I could get Mia to engage too if we want.
Sure.
And Charlie, have you seen anything from the state of Idaho that would prohibit cities from even looking at, the definition of semi-permanent living with a time ordinance? As far as we could tell, the state gives the authorities for cities to respond.
I have a comment on that. I know that the city of Boise and Ada County are both very interested in how Garden City is going to tackle this. In speaking to their staff at both jurisdictions, they've interpreted, it's my understanding that they've interpreted the Idaho code would preclude this particular proposal, but they are curious to see how Garden City moves forward.
I mean, this feels like a little bit of a gray area. I just see some speed bumps and some hurdles that I don't know collectively or whatever that we're going to have to figure out. But
and that's what we were kind of hoping to do, is go through the section of code. We did have a couple just points of clarification that were not accurate in the staff report, just 2 small items, nothing major. But we wanted to go through and see what are those sideboards or what are those parameters that design review or the city feel are going to be best received.
And I appreciate that. And I was going to go there, but as Mr. Wadhams came down specifically to address potential legality issues, whether or not the city has legal authority, and also what would be the mechanism to move forward to ensure that they're safe, sounding like the RVIA standards where you're landing. I did want to just address that point first, and then broad strokes on the staff report, just questions and points of discussions for the different committees. Start on page 8. Definitions. Staff has noted that perhaps having a more succinct definitions might alleviate the need for additional definitions and language formalities, such as perhaps usually do not versus don't, or utilizing consistent language as otherwise found in codes. And then regulations, just making sure that there are no conflicts as proposed in other sections of code. And then specifically 82C14, the Planning and Zoning Commission had made recommendations to accessory dwelling units. And is this the time to incorporate those recommendations as well? And then staff has noted that perhaps for consistency with code, looking to already establish code sections to guide standards, such as the mobile home codes or the RV standards, 84J, 82C 33. And that may be a particular interest for the design review to discuss, as it will affect the design specifically. And then that may bleed into how to specifically address affordability. If this is a code specifically intended to address affordability, or maybe it's not, maybe it is just truly for tiny homes on wheels. But some of the design standards might be better placed outside of the tiny home communities and perhaps in other sections of code like 840D. You know, if parking is a way to address affordability, perhaps looking at that section that can be utilized for different uses, not just tiny home communities. And so those are really broad strokes. There's a lot of questions that are found, you know, throughout the staff report, just trying to do a thorough discussion, initiate a thorough discussion. And with that, I'll turn it over to the committee if they want to dive into any particular issue.
I think looking at it from 30,000 feet, there's a couple issues that are going on. One is, how do you get the unit itself to be code compliant and safe? And then the other issue is, where do they go? And how does that fit into existing neighborhoods? And I think my biggest concern as I read through it was, how do the individual units meet code, and are they safe for getting in and out? Are they safe in fire? Are they energy code compliant? Those sorts of things. And I think Jason addressed one of those with an RV standard that they would each comply to. And I think that's a direction to go. I don't know how then, if it's classified as an RV, does it then change parameters of where it can go and what it's hooked up to and those sorts of things. But definitely it has to be reviewed and inspected and looked at in some manner by some authority that can say, yes, this is safe to live in. That speaks to maybe some of the terminology that was in the proposed code changes, talking about, you know, it could be built by a professional or it could be built DIY. So that jumped out at me as a concern, is if someone's building this in their backyard with no one looking over their shoulder on if the plumbing flows downhill or if the electrical is hooked up properly, you know, at what point does that become a safety hazard? So that was one of the biggest concern I think that jumped out at me, is who's inspecting this and how does this become approved to be safe, to be habitable? And then where it goes and how it's plugged in, and, you know, in what sort of community that's in. That's a separate conversation from, is this unit safe to be occupied? There's a lot of terminology, and there's a lot of, you know, acronyms that make one thing different from another thing, And I think most of the jurisdictions that have addressed this around the country are talking about tiny homes on foundations. And there's even a, you know, subsection Q to the IRC speaks to tiny homes specifically, and, you know, different stair rise run codes and different, you know, loft egress codes and all of those sorts of things, and different habitable space sizes that allow people to make tiny homes on foundations accessible and easier to permit. So it's kind of two things that we have to look at. One is the unit safe, and then two is the community that's being created applicable and something that Garden City wants to embrace. So there's a couple of initial thoughts that I had.
And if I could just thank you, committee member Hurd, but I think that appendix Q is only for tiny homes on foundations.
It is correct. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Thank you.
And that's where it becomes tricky, is, you know, there's a lot of things that are understood now about tiny homes and how people are using them, but then we get into all the different acronyms of them being on wheels or them being RVs, or, you know, that sort of thing is where we get into the weeds and it gets complicated.
And can I ask a quick question of Charlie again, since Derek kind of brought it up? So I think when we talked with building at City of Boise, you know, they already have legalized tiny homes on foundations, but they're in the process of working to legalize tiny homes on wheels also. And so our question for the City of Boise, and especially building, was how are you going to regulate that? Right? Because that we figured that question would come back to us, which was like, okay, if they're on wheels, are they going to be RVs or what's the actual thing? And so I think the City of Boise believes that they can simply write the regulations into the development code. So in other words, if there's concerns with safety or fire, they'll write those into their own development code, because tiny houses don't exist at the Idaho state level. There is no tiny house.
I have
So
a question related to your conversation then. So you're stating that their planning staff would do the safety inspections?
I'm saying that at least from their building side, their building guy said, look, that wouldn't be us, that it would be development code that would actually regulate whatever it is that the city wants to regulate within those. You know, because there's a gray area, I guess it would be written into the city's own code. It wouldn't be part of Idaho code, because tiny houses don't exist in Idaho code. And so I think I think that we're open to looking at whatever things need to be added to the code that would make the city feel like, okay, this is a safe, process that we have. There's some sort of process where the city maybe does the inspections of those, or they have somebody sign a waiver saying, hey, we've actually met this, and this, like, because I do see that City of Boise is looking at allowing people who have built their own tiny homes to be able to live in them. So in order to get from somebody building their own, like Derek kind of brought up, there's obviously some concerns that, like, what if they didn't build that in a safe way? And so I think that's there's some method that the city can use to actually be able to look at it and go, okay, yeah, we feel this is safe, that this person can live in it.
So what I think I'm hearing perhaps direction, even though committee member Hurd didn't give it strict direction, but maybe identifying the different types of tiny homes, not just limiting it to tiny homes on wheels, but maybe tiny homes on foundations as well, and identifying a safety certification that could be required for those. Not putting too many words in your mouth.
Well, I mean, I think tiny homes on foundations are already legal in Garden City.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
I think the tiny homes on foundations are already legal in Garden
Sure,
City.
they are. Tiny homes are legal. It's just how you address them. If a tiny home meets RVIA standards, it can go into an RV park or be utilized as an RV at this point in time. If it's stick built, it can adhere to either multifamily or ADU. So they're legal now, but the change thereof to create a tiny home community is where I think you're going with this.
Well, and I think what we're saying is, yes, tiny homes as RVs are technically already legal in Garden City and RV parks, but there are no RV parks in Garden City. And that's because the Garden City Code has a 3-acre limitation to creating an RV park.
There's no RV parks. Isn't there an RV park that's just right down there, across the street from City Hall?
That's on the Ada County property.
Oh,
It's
is it
not
on
in
county property? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the question about the tiny home on wheels in a kind of a community setting has to be one that other jurisdictions have wrestled with. And if there are examples of what they've done to, in other states, in other cities, of what they've done to be able to allow this, it would be kind of interesting. And I I guess I would like to know and see some examples of what other cities have done to incorporate that into their code and allow it in a kind of a community setting or development, so to speak, with tiny home on wheels and not tiny homes on foundations.
And would you, sorry, question, Brett, would you like examples around the US and examples in Idaho?
I didn't think there were any in Idaho that were tiny homes on wheels that could be in another location other than like RV parks.
Gotcha. Okay.
So that really isn't what you guys are seeking to achieve here, correct?
That's correct. We do want a community setting. And
Yeah.
so what we proposed had quite a few, what we felt was quite a few restrictions. But we could, I guess, do some sample mock-ups of how that might be applied for visuals. And then,
Well, I'm just curious as to what, if these community type settings are being allowed in some of these other cities, what have they put, what are the parameters that they've put into their code and ordinances that was part of the process of them, allowing it
gotcha.
in those jurisdictions. And just, I'm curious to see what kind of, is it certain type of amenities and setbacks and, just how
Yeah.
they've handled it in order to feel comfortable about allowing it to happen.
Perfect. Yeah.
And if I can
So I
add,
think, I just wanted to add one thing really quick. I think that staff in their report, they really outlined a lot of different things that could be, that I agreed with. I agreed pretty much every point that was in the staff report, by the way. I think that we need to look at this from how do we allow this? And I like Brett's suggestion about, well, how are other people's doing it? Can we just, make sure that the safety concerns, because I do think that is a large concern, are being addressed, as well as the other issue that Derek addressed as far as how are they allowed. I think some of the kind of potential code amendments or suggestions that were in the staff report are the route to go. And maybe we can just take another look at how some of these other places are doing and how these suggestions that were in the staff report, how they align with that, to make some recommendations.
can I add to Ms. Ball's point, that we may have some preemption issues here too. If you're looking at, and I put it in my memo, I referenced it in my memo, I think Ms. Thornborrow just referenced it, but the Division of Building Safety, DBS, State of Idaho, they have a 2-page flyer on their website, and it straight up says, tiny houses, manufactured homes, modular buildings, and recreational vehicles defined. It says all structures built for use as a dwelling place, including tiny houses, must fall into one of the following classifications. So they're saying it must be one of these things in Idaho, either site-built, modular building, manufactured home, or recreational vehicle. Those are the things we have to pick from. I think we're preempted from picking something else. And then it goes on to, so if we're talking about recreational vehicle, it seems like that's the closest thing that we're talking about here. Then you flip the page and it starts talking about, now we're looking at the definition under 49.119. If it has a RV trailer tag, that maybe would address some of the safety concerns, but it would need a trailer tag or something like that, or a HUD label. No, not a HUD label, a RV trailer tag under RVIA, like what Mr. Jones was saying. But it looks to me like those are the 4 things we have to choose from, and we may be preempted from creating something else.
I think you're right, Charlie. I think that the item number 1 by I don't know where else to start other than that point. I think that's the first item.
Well, and Charlie, I think you're right too. I mean, I think what we're saying though is this, that it's okay if Idaho looks at all the tiny houses in the world as RVs. That's fine to us. But what we're also saying is we see that Garden City probably doesn't really want a 3-acre RV park, because that's what code now allows in those zones. And so what we're saying is, hey, what we think is that Garden City should maybe have a stricter code that requires something that's not just an RV park, because RV park standards aren't great. You know, there's some things going on in RV parks that people don't like. I mean, like I said, they don't have to have their own separate septic hookup, right? And I think the way tiny houses are designed, they really should be hooked up to actual city services directly. And so I think what we're saying is, yeah, it's fine if the state sees these as RVs, but we want to create code to allow for actual tiny house communities to function like communities.
That really spell out parameters and have amenities and open space and affordability. I mean, we want to start at the point of acknowledging it's an RV, but to define it as a tiny house community. I guess that's the end. That's the last square. So yes, we start with it's an RV if needed, because you're right, Charlie, that's where the start happens. But then we put parameters. One of those parameters is what constitutes semi-permanent living? What's the timeline? Where are these tiny house communities best? What zones are appropriate? What do amenities look like? What type of certifications, to Derek's point, where are they going and how are they code compliant? You know, within that, we break those mechanics down. So what we know where they're going to tiny house communities.
Well, and I think like getting to that point of having some code, it also is this, that all tiny houses might be considered RVs to the state of Idaho, but Garden City doesn't have to consider every RV a tiny house.
That's right.
And I think that's the big picture. Because like I said, if we parked some RVs out next to the market, we wouldn't have people coming over and gazing at them and going, no, this is awesome. Are these legal? Where are you going to put them? Where is somebody going to live here? You know, we wouldn't actually have those questions if it's just an RV. And so I think there's something different about tiny houses that's clearly different. And so I think it's fine to look and go, hey, the state of Idaho considers all these things RVs. But for Garden City, we want to create something better than an RV park, which is why this code is there. Because you're right, we could just go get 3 acres and then build a giant 3-acre RV park and then have a couple of tiny houses in it. But that's not really the same thing as what we're trying to do.
Yeah, you're creating RVs, right? You're building tiny houses that are RVs, and then you want to put them in you want to put them in tiny house communities. So it's like all the instances where Garden City code says RV, there's parentheses that said except in tiny home communities, right? You kind of have to undo some of the RV definitions and RV requirements to make exceptions to the tiny homes.
Well, I think we're actually adding a whole thing that gives a definition to tiny homes
of the community
that's separate from RV. Like it might include, some RVs might be included in that, right? The ones that are tiny homes, but nothing, and all the rest of the RVs aren't. So I think that's kind of what we see, is that this is a chance to allow something that nobody is against, you know, because right now, you know, there are people in tiny homes in Garden City, there are people in tiny homes in Boise, but that's all illegal right now. So we don't see that should be criminalized right now. People who are living in a tiny house, that probably shouldn't be illegal. So the question is, how do we make it legal and make it, because again, I don't think there's anybody who's opposed to tiny houses. You know, there's enough TV shows that it's become trendy and it seems like the cool thing to do. So the question is, what do we need to create code wise to make everybody feel good about the fact that it's going to be not an eyesore. It's not going to be a giant 3-acre RV park, because the truth is that's legal. In the C2 zone that we're proposing for this, the RV parks are also legal. They could be built there. And so, yeah, we could just build an RV park. But again, I think we're trying to say, hey, there may be some RVs that might be cool and trendy, like Airstreams these days are kind of cool and trendy. But not everything is going to fit with the idea of, what somebody has for their tiny house community that they might want to build. And not all RVs fit that.
It's almost in a way like a tiny house RV park,
Yeah, right.
where
Sure.
it's an RV park because tiny houses on wheels regulated as RVIA compliant, so they're really RVs. So you're kind of creating a different setting for them that's different than a traditional RV park. So
Sure.
lower density, perhaps a higher level of amenities and like, open space and all the rest of that to create that different setting for those type of RVs. And not that setting, like Jason was saying, not that one of those tiny house communities couldn't also have a RV in it that was a really cool retro RV thing. I mean, that made some sense. It wouldn't necessarily exclude that, but it wouldn't be the primary function. And I don't know how you cross those two, because you really want this separate for, I would think, separate for, it's a tiny house RV park, and that's all that's in there. And that's why we have these different requirements in the code.
Here's one thing though, we're saying RV, but recreational vehicles, you're not supposed to be living in them.
Sure.
They're for recreation, which goes back to, I think, both Jason and Hannah's point, potentially, creating something that makes it a potentially permanent residence versus an RV or an RV park. We're trying to make these actual homes that people live in more than a camping trip, more than something that the recreational vehicle standards don't really address, because it's not a house, it's not a home, it's just a recreational vehicle. So there's not adequate, lack of a better term, code to have a safe dwelling.
Well, and to your point, Maureen, I think that is another important conversation is, what does the city feel comfortable, what I call semi-permanent? We want to achieve affordability, so it needs to be semi-permanent in nature. But what is that timeline of comfort? Is it 1 year, 2 years, and the houses need to go off? Do they need to stay what we call in tow to assure they can be moved on and off? I mean, that's those sideboards that I think are important to ask. And what I've seen is, I don't think there's anything that prohibits Garden City from making those definitions in their own sections of code.
Yeah, Maureen, I think you made a good point, and I'm going to jump off of Hannah's point there. So I think that is how cities regulate them being permanent living, is they make them move. That's actually the only way they regulate them. Because the real truth is, if you went to the RV park there at the Expo Idaho site, it's 100% full all the time. And I'm going to tell you that everybody who's there lives there. So those people are living in RVs 100% of the time. And the way they simply regulate what Idaho law says they have to do, because it can't be a permanent living situation, is they make them move. Now, the people are still living in them, but they just move them. So I think what we're saying is Garden City can set their own timelines for how often those tiny homes need to move. And we think it should be, like I said, the truth of the matter is tiny homes are a more long-term living solution. If you come and look at how they're built, they're not built like RVs. They're really built like exactly like a house is built. So they really are built long-term, even though they're going to be zoned as RVs, because that's a gray area right now. And Idaho doesn't have a code that fits that perfectly in between. But I think that's what we're saying is, what would you be comfortable with in terms of a timeline for saying, look, if this can be moved every year, then it's clearly not permanently there. Because that is the hoop right now that all of Idaho uses. That's what Garden City uses to classify things as not being permanent. And so I think that what we're saying is, Garden City's going to have to make a decision. How often do they want these tiny homes moved? But to me, like I said, as long as they can be moved, I think you can make the argument that they're not there permanently. It's when they become impossible to move that they basically become permanent.
Which makes me question, if I go down the street to the closest mobile home park, not a new one, so it's not 3 acres. Oh, that's RV parks. But if I go down the street to the closest mobile home park, what's the difference between that community and this proposed tiny house community? They're on wheels. They're tied up to city services. They each have their own lot. What's the difference between A and B?
Many things different and yet many things similar. So one thing that I've found really interesting in looking at mobile home parks in Garden City is that they are on chassis still. And there is not a regulation in Garden City Code that says they need to be fixed to slab or block. And I found that to be interesting because the city is saying because they're HUD certified. And so there's really not even a clear definition as to how they anchor them to the land. I thought that was an interesting one. I also thought it was interesting when a new mobile home comes into a mobile home community, that application doesn't go through the design review process, nor does it even trigger certain improvements that have to be done in that community. So, I mean, just minimal things.
That's not exactly true. I might correct you on that. So
Okay.
there are regulations that the state has adopted on how to tie down homes that are outside of the floodplain. If they're in the floodplain, they need to be anchored to a foundation. And then the Garden City Code does require that each space is brought up to compliance within the park if a new unit's being brought into that space. So it has to meet the 4,000 square foot space requirement, a certain level of things that are identified in code. So the entire park may not have to be brought up. So say you have a park where the setbacks aren't being met between 2 units, but there's another unit across the park that is being placed, that particular space is reviewed for compliance, as well as some of the life safety components of the park, such as that there's a sign so EMS knows where to go, et cetera.
I apologize, but I have a suggestion that we pause this conversation and go back to the agenda. And I only say this because I do have another meeting at 5 o'clock, and I want to make sure that we have a quorum, no split votes and that kind of stuff on the other 2 items, or at least that first item. And then we can come back to this. And then if the conversation continues, because this is really good conversation, I won't mess it up by having to leave.
Thank you.
Whereas I might mess up the other items. I apologize for that.
No, and this was a lot of really good information. We know we went down a rabbit hole on any detail. So what we thought too is just getting some really broad outlines. This is really good information. And again, we were going to even suggest another round of design review so that everybody can process where we are today. Another discussion on where we are. Like, again, I have some pretty big takeaways that I could outline for simplicity. So we're happy to do that. Again, this is going to take some time and work.
Derek, Brett, are you guys okay with that? Okay, thank you.
Well, and I think we can
appreciate
get,
that.
we can get what Brett wants for maybe the next meeting, if we
Yeah.
can push back to that point, and we can have some examples with some specific stuff about how some other cities dealt with it, because we do have some other cities that have done tiny houses on wheels. So we can have those examples that could be sent to you beforehand.
That
Yeah.
sounds great.
Specific samples of ordinance and code, and then Charlie can look at them and we could have a starting and an ending place so that everybody can say, okay, I think this is good. This is a lot to take in any one meeting.
And it sounds like we may come back to this discussion today.
Okay, that's
Suss
fine.
out some other standards, but with that, I'll move us back to the consent agenda.
Awesome.
And thank you.
I'll
So
move to,
thank you.
I'll move to approve the consent agenda as written with the meeting minutes as written.
And I'll take the head nod as a second.
Second.
Brett, all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. And then moving on to subdivision fiscal year 2021, number 8. McAnulty with Chrysalis requesting a preliminary and final plat plan unit development for 12 residential lots at 304 East 45th Street. And then I'm not seeing, oh, I am seeing Matt and Richard Wilmot, so I'll turn it over to either one of you.
Good afternoon. This is Richard. Can everybody hear me?
We can, thank you.
Yes.
Perfect. Jenna, can I share my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. This is sort of a continuance of our previous design review meeting regarding our PUD final plat, preliminary plat request. Some of the things that were previously identified in our staff report and also brought up at the meeting, we've gone through our latest proposal and revised the various items to hopefully satisfactorily address a lot of those comments. I'll sort of start from the top and the simple ones. One of the questions raised was this idea of Iota Street being a public versus private. Just a few days after we had our meeting and also our planning and zoning meeting, ACHD had finally provided their staff report, and they identified Iota as a public street, which we had sort of anticipated, but now it's actually identified and being acknowledged that way. And with that, we have shown a detached sidewalk along both Iota and along 45th Street that we believe is in compliance with the ACHD standards and Garden City requirements. It did necessitate kind of shifting the buildings to this, let's just say this northerly side property line. But we were still able to keep the intent of the project intact fairly well. So detached sidewalk, we also have our garages attached to each unit, fully enclosed, and then we have our individual parking spaces out in front of each of the unit in the driveway. Related to that, one of the other items that was sort of questioned during the design review hearing was the let's just say the entrance or the prominence of the garages relative to the unit entries. There's a couple of things we did here, both architecturally and as well as on the site. You'll see these little pathways that we've incorporated now that are separated from the themselves. I would just like to say that these are like a concrete paver pathway or something to that effect, but they're separated by a little bit of landscaping, and then we actually have our driveway for the unit. So where we do have two units that are, let's just say, interior, and the entries are very near one another, we felt that it was appropriate to just have those share over the property line, a walkway access. So the goal there is that we still are maintaining some semblance of some landscaping along the fronts of these units to be able to plant a few trees and get some ground cover in there to sort of soften up the streetscape a little bit. Architecturally speaking, we revised kind of the entry zone of these units themselves by incorporating, let's just say, more visual, more glass, both at the entry level and then above in the bay or pop out area. This bay also sticks out from the front of the unit to provide some covering. You can kind of see the little bit of shade and shadow there, but it protrudes from the building wall a few feet to provide some weather protection at each of those entry doors. And so we hope that is satisfactorily addressing the prominence of these versus, say, the garage doors, which we anticipate just sort of being secondary to the overall elevation. Yes, these are framed within a feature here. However, the purpose of that is to provide some covering over these patios and accentuate sort of the top roof area of these buildings. One of the other items that was questioned during our previous review was providing access for the unit along 45th Street. We've since redesigned this unit to now be a different bedroom count and a different layout entirely. It now has a front door that is accessed directly from the sidewalk. It still has its garage coming out from VIII, and it's a little patio on the corner here. And so this now is let's just say directly accessing the street. So we felt that the solution there was complementary of what the request was. And that also allowed us to provide some variety of units, both architecturally. Let's see, on the facade here. There. So this elevation is that elevation that would front onto 45th Street, and we've highlighted the entry here with some different materiality, recessed the entry a bit to provide some weather protection, and then this comes into what we're kind of calling a bonus or a living room area on the ground floor. And so each of those facades are now different from building to building. They're no longer the same. Previously, we were anticipating just building the same building, but they're actually fundamentally different now. As a point of comparison, this is the unit on 45th Street. And then this is the unit that's farther back. What we've done is changed the position of the roof framed element that is no longer over the garage areas. And then on the garages themselves, we've actually introduced glazing just to provide some transparency and fenestration there. So those buildings are actually now structurally and fundamentally different. I don't recall what other comments we had. I think the biggie was just trying to get that variety of units and then getting the architectural elements just different from one another from building to building. And so trying to keep the development consistent. We've used some similar colors, obviously similar materials, but we've used them in different ways in different positions and things like that. So in general, those are the adjustments we have made, and be open to any questions or thoughts.
All right, any questions of the applicant? Hearing none, I'll turn it over to Ms. Veal for a staff report.
Good afternoon, everyone. The applicant was able to submit their resubmittals on or by November 1st, 2021, allowing them to be at this hearing today. They were able to submit new site plans, new landscape plans, and new elevations. Some new comments were made by ACHD as well as the Garden City engineer. So Iota Street has been confirmed to be a public street maintained by ACHD, which ends up requiring the 5-foot wide detached sidewalk, which has been provided in the submitted landscape and site plans. However, by this accommodation of the detached sidewalk, it also forced the dwelling units to be shoved back, or rather northeast, I suppose, which resulted in the request for a waiver through the planned unit development. The typical base standard rear setback is 15 feet, and the applicant is now asking for a 5-foot rear setback to accommodate that detached sidewalk on Iota Street. The end unit, also known as Lot 13, was required to face 45th Street, which it is now doing. The elevations do show that in the resubmittals from November 1st. And it also shows that it's a different floor plan, with the first floor consisting of a bonus room and a powder room versus a master bedroom and bath. This is the only dwelling unit that is arranged this way. There are discrepancies between the landscape plan and the site plan as far as how much square footage is shown or for landscaping. There is a condition in the drafted decision document that any kind of discrepancies would refer back to the landscape plan submitted on November 1st, showing that 9,680 square feet of landscaping is provided. I have also updated the PUD waivers list in accordance with what the applicant has requested, what the committee's discussed, and then an additional waiver that I have recommended depending on what the committee decides as far as how much common open space is provided. So we have the 4 waivers. There's the first being a waiver to the 0.5 or half a guest parking space provided for every dwelling unit, allowing for 1 guest parking spot for every 4 dwelling units. Then there's the second waiver being for the enclosed vehicular parking for every dwelling unit, allowing for one of those required 2 enclosed parking spaces to be located on the individual unit's driveway. And then the third waiver is a minimum of 10% common open space, or a waiver to the minimum of 10%. The application provides 8% common open space. So this waiver is what I recommended as a potential waiver to be requested. Otherwise, it is also drafted in the decision document to require the 10%. So we have conflicting conditions there. It's either the waiver or the requirement of providing 10% common open space. And then the last waiver being the rear setback being only 5 feet instead of the base zoning requiring 15. I also omitted the original waiver request for the variety of housing types, as both the design review committee and the planning and zoning commission said that the application could not waive PUD standards. Then the Garden City engineer was able to review their new construction plans and provide an additional 44 comments. Essentially, it was a pre-construction plan review. 44 comments is not abnormal in this case. However, there are a few that I highlighted in the staff report being the most concerning, but it could be addressed at a later point. So if you were to recommend approval or denial today, the plans that the city engineer requested could be given at a later date. Additionally, there are trees identified on the site. However, a tree mitigation plan has not been submitted to staff to review. It's been conditioned that a certified arborist letter is required, identifying healthy, dead, dying, or diseased trees on the site prior to the approval of construction plans. This could impact how the landscaping is provided or how much landscaping is provided, given that it looks like the site's just going to clear cut everything existing and then hopefully be able to mitigate for any of the healthy tree calipers that are removed. If tree mitigation isn't accounted for during the construction plans review process, it's possible that the applicant will have to come back to design review if they have to change their site drastically enough to accommodate for those tree calipers. Oh, and then lastly, with the shift of the detached sidewalk, or rather the accommodation of the detached sidewalk on Iota Street, I wasn't able to review the length and width of the drive aisles, and because the site is allowing for the individual parking spaces on the driveways, the driveways need to be at least 10 by 20, and it looks like Richard is navigating that right now. And with that, I stand for questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Veal?
I have a quick question. This is currently zoned R3, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Is there any reason why this submittal could not happen under R3? I guess I'm still confused why we're doing a PUD.
So essentially, the reason why they're still requesting a PUD, as far as I understand, is to accommodate for the lack of guest parking, and then also to accommodate for the enclosed parking spaces. Based off of the bedroom count, all of the parking spaces for the residential units need to be within an enclosed garage. Right now, they're providing one of those spots in the garage, one of those spots on their driveway, and then there's only 3 guest parking spots versus the actual amount that's required, which I don't know off the top of my head.
So I just want to make a comment, and I'll read this from the staff report. Under purpose of a planned unit development, it's the intent of this section is to provide for well-planned developments which conform to the objectives of this title, but may deviate in certain respects from the zoning map and the district regulations. It is not the intent that the planned unit development process be used solely for the purposes of deviating from dimensional standards in the district, unless the following objectives are achieved. And by the way, I'm on page 9 of the staff report. And it lists 5 objectives. I'm having a hard time understanding how it meets any of those objectives. That's just for the rest of the design committee's consideration.
Right. And before we move on to the public hearing, are there any other comments or questions of staff? Okay, with that, I'll open the public hearing. Is there anybody that wishes to testify? If so, you can use the raise your hand feature. Or since there aren't very many people in attendance, you can unmute yourself and note that you wish to testify. All right, seeing none, I'll pass it back over to you, Mr. Wilmot, and for you to respond to anything that came up in the staff report, and also your perspective on how it meets plan unit development objectives.
Sounds good. Thank you. I think, again, we touched on the Iota Street status. We don't really have any follow-up there. We touched on the end unit and the differing floor plans and the varieties thereof. We touched on that. I don't see any real concerns there. In terms of the discrepancy between architectural and landscape, I don't feel that there's enough of a difference there to where that can't be rectified to where those numbers can match. Our plans are basically the same. It might be just how they were calculated between our numbers and the landscape architect's numbers. As far as the waivers that are being asked for, again, we feel that we have the adequate amount of parking, and with the reduction in the guest parking spaces, the intent here is that these are livable, functional units with adequate amount of open space, and taking that open space up with guest parking, we don't see the necessary benefit in that, especially how close it is to bus transit and the walkability, and that we're providing storage for bicycle parking within the units themselves. We'd be eliminating open space to put in parking. So fundamentally, that just doesn't make sense to me. However, if that's a very strong concern, I'm sure we could figure out something to accommodate some additional guest parking spaces, but we would prefer this development to be more open than it would be accommodating of additional parking spaces that are not really necessary. In terms of the 10% open space, I think that the difference that we're seeing there between the 8 and the 10%, our landscape architect is showing that we've got the 10%, and if we're showing 8 on our analysis, we'll make sure that matches properly. We did reduce the rear yard setback slightly to accommodate the unit count. Again, we're trying to provide a livable unit that has enough bedrooms to be responsive to our needs and sort of the housing crisis that we're experiencing now. And we think that this development fits well with that particular ratio. And so we would like to try to maintain our 3-bedroom count as much as possible. We did reduce that in one of the units in unit number 1 to accommodate 2 bedrooms. But the space that we're showing for our footprint is really what is necessitating that reduced setback there. It's not uncommon that a reduced setback along the rear property line is necessary. We did this on a similar project over on Reed Street, and we were able to accommodate the requirement there, and we hope that we're doing the same thing here. As far as meeting the intent of the PUD, there's a number of things that make this a PUD over it being just strictly zoned R3. You know, we've got lot widths themselves that aren't allowed within the R3, so we need a skinnier lot width. lot area is also a question relative to just a straight zone. So I think if we were to go into an R3, we'd be asking for a bunch of variances to get there. And with the PUD, it just gives us the flexibility now to make those decisions. And also it allows us to ask for less waivers under the PUD than it would be asking for more variances under the straight zone of R3. So with that, and we had our pre-application meeting with staff, and this was the determination. So we're following those recommendations. We would have gladly done anything else, but to question it at this stage, I'm not saying that it's inappropriate to question it, but we've gone through the motions at this moment to go this route because everybody felt that the PUD was simpler, more appropriate response to get us. With that, I will open it back up to staff and the.
Great. Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Wilmot?
I do have a question on this. So on that Iota Street, is that a dead end street?
It's only a dead end now. It has, according to what ACHD has said, and also in their comments, is that it's to be extended in the future. So they're actually requesting us to put a sign or something along the fencing that's on that property line to identify that this road will be extended in the future. And so we've planned for that.
So, well, in the meantime, how do you accommodate fire truck turnaround?
We're in the process of talking about with ACHD what their future looks like. What we understand ACHD is intending to do is to actually extend this in the near future. Whether that means 2 years or 10 years, I don't know that yet. But what we would do is basically get with the fire department and say, listen, can we make a concession here to allow for something that will be temporary because it's going to be extended. At any moment that somebody's going to ask for development on those adjacent properties, they're going to have to extend IOTA, is what I understand from ACHD. So to put in a big turnaround, either that or a hammerhead or something more substantial, we would ask the fire department that that they allow us to do like a fire hydrant and then utilize a portion of our guest parking as a potential turnaround location if it was ever needed.
Okay, good luck with that. Yeah, a cul-de-sac down at the end or some kind of turnaround would significantly alter your design. So I guess depending on how that ends up, we may be needing to look at this in the future.
It certainly is a possibility, but again, we'd be compromising for something temporary when this has every indication that it's going to get extended.
Okay. Well, I'll let the fire department address that then. I was just pointing it out. I guess the PUD process does not necessarily allow for like reduction in covered parking or reduction in guest parking or so those are the variance items that we need to be considering at this point in time with this application. And I guess I don't know how I feel about the having, I mean, this is going to be tight anyways, and then having one of the no ability for any guest parking at these units because all of their required parking is taken up by driveway and one space that's covered. It just seems to me that with this many units in there, I just having trouble with reduction in the guest parking. And also the driveways are not even able to be utilized for guest parking. If with a 3-bedroom home, two stalls, yeah, I don't know. I'm having a hard time with the reduction of the guest parking and the variance on the covered.
So if I could jump in there for a second, Brett, you know, if this were to be in Boise, we would be overparked effectively. For a 3-bedroom, they only require 1.5 and 1 space for every 10 required spaces, which is 2.4 guest parking spaces. So we could certainly provide, if the commission desired, you know, obviously we'd have to provide adequate guest parking based on what the commission desired. But what I'm suggesting is not out of character for what is acceptable in other jurisdictions. So I would just prefer to have the open space in lieu of having more parking.
Well, I mean, I kind of view what we're doing here as a committee is to of course look primarily initially at Garden City Code and not to say that there's maybe Garden City Code will change in the future to address trends and less parking and the rest of that, but right now it is what it is. And I don't think it's a trade-off necessarily. I think it should be both. I think the open space requirement should be met and the guest parking ratio should be met. And not, well, we'll meet one, but it's at the expense of the other. Yeah. What are thoughts from the other committee members?
Yeah, I think you're heading in the right direction, Brett. And I don't know if maybe this is one of those instances where we look at, can this extra parking spot or two be kind of flex space and be grass pavers that's connected to a plaza. So in a pinch, it's guest parking, but most of the time it, looks like common space, open space.
In general, if we needed to, if we were able to provide something like that, we could do that. But again, we just want it to be usable and functional for the open space requirement. So
Yeah.
if there is some means of accommodating that through a flex space that is designated for parking, we just didn't have anything permanent in that location. We're not opposed to something like that, but I just want it to be usable and functional for the open space areas.
Yeah, I guess I struggle with that combination because it's not open space when somebody's parked on the top of it.
Right, exactly.
Is there not on-street parking on 45th?
Not in this, on 45th Street there is. On Iota, this street section does not allow for on-street parking. Plus our driveways are too close together.
And
But
even,
on 45th Street, there is on-street parking in that street section.
and even after the other side of Iota develops, it still won't have on-street parking.
I couldn't say what would happen here, but my feeling is that ACHD would continue this street section straight through. They probably wouldn't allow for the curb to deviate. And that just is pure, that would be my speculation, but I'm sure it would depend on how they anticipate developing. But with these being single family attached, this seemed like the most appropriate response. If we had on-street parking along 45th Street and indicated that as such, I think we would have to go to ACHD to get their blessing to that. But then how would the commission view that in terms of those spaces being allocated for this development? Because they'd be public parking at that point.
Yeah, I don't think they could be allocated for this development. But I think, haven't we, committee members, correct me if I'm wrong, but haven't we looked at the on-street parking as that it could be utilized as some of the required guest parking? Or have we, it seemed to me on some projects that,
Yeah, I'm not sure what section it's in or if it applies to this, but in some instances, you can count one of the on-streets.
that's what it was, one of the
Yeah.
on-street.
And I don't know if it's completely applicable. Staff may have better direction.
So what we're talking about, if I'm not mistaken, is 3 additional guest parking spaces.
I think that's what you're short right now from what's
Yes.
required in code.
Yep. And I don't want to understate, the way Garden City's code is written now. However, I think I'm just resistant to how much guest parking is necessary. It just seems like a lot, and when compared to those other jurisdictions, especially when we're so close to Adams, which is a bus transit. We're so close to the Greenbelt, and we're trying to encourage alternative modes of transportation. It just seems like a lot for such a small infill development. It'd be one thing if we had 10 acres or even an acre at this stage, but we don't. We're purposely trying to provide an infill development that's functional and provides an interesting and goal-oriented solution for increasing the amount of bedrooms.
Yeah, I can't say that I'm gonna get super hung up on the guest parking just because there is, you know, there is 2 per unit for most of the units. And it is close to transit, and the points that the applicant's bringing up, I'm not gonna get too hung up on it because we have reduced guest parking on a lot of PUDs that have come through. So I don't think that's gonna make or break my decision on this one. I do want to speak to Maureen's talking about the PUD in general, and reading through those criteria. I understand how the application got here, and it is often a tool that people use. I do think it bears noting that, you know, we have to kind of step back and ask, why are you doing this? What is the purpose of you doing this? And it seems like the answer in a lot of PUD applications is, oh, it's to avoid this and to avoid that, and, you know, make it easier. But when I read through those, you know, unless these are achieved, I think it is denser. It is, you know, a higher density infill with tighter lot lines and less square footage per lot that they're achieving through this PUD. But then I come back to something that often trips me up is the choice of living environments and those sorts of, you know, how are we providing a variety of housing? And this, when we're looking at it, when we're looking at checking this box, it's providing a maximum choice of living environments by allowing a variety of housing. So in one of their code criteria, we're just saying it has to provide these choices in living environments. And now to say, to be a PUD, it has to provide a maximum choice of living environments. So it kind of makes that, you know, choice in housing. And to me, that means not only the architectural style, but 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, studio, 3 bedroom. You know, is this providing a maximum choice? It's gone from all 3 bedroom, 2 baths to now there's 1 that's on the end unit that's a little bit different. So I don't know if it's creating that maximum variety that this criteria would have us check that box to satisfy the PUD. But I think it is meeting it's more dense, it's more, you know, kind of has a more urban feel, it's using land more efficiently. So it checks all of those boxes for me, but I struggle with the first one.
And to your point, Commissioner Hurd, we also struggle with what that determination is of variety of housing. I think I specifically asked in our first hearing what that means to the commission, right? And it's not that we're looking for you to give us the answer. We just want to know, get some understanding of what that means for the variety of housing. You know, we've architecturally, we've tried to do that by providing something that we think is interesting and contemporary. But is it truly in this type or this size of development? Again, I go back to that where we're dealing with just 12 lots. It's not like we're dealing with 60. And we can provide some alternating variety within each of these units. But what does what does that look like? Is it truly every other one that's different? There has to be some understanding, at least from our perspective, as to what that means to the commission to say, or the committee to say, we would like to have X amount, right? Can we try to achieve this? And so we also struggle with that. And again, I would ask the committee, what does that mean to you? If that is truly something that we want to strive towards in terms of maximization, what does that look like? And we could certainly try to accommodate that wherever possible, but to us, with only 12 lots, it really becomes quite challenging, just in terms of let's just say a cost efficiency. And we're all dealing with this right now in terms of just the availability of material, the availability of labor, and then now we're introducing what could be some fairly complex design solutions, with going from a 1-bedroom to a 2-bedroom to a 3-bedroom, and then back to a 1-bedroom and a 2-bedroom and a 3-bedroom. It's not to say that we don't want to do that. We just want to understand what that looks like, and what that understanding is from the committee, so that we can help achieve that, right? But on the same right, we could certainly look at trying to incorporate a few more 2-bedrooms. Logically, if we have this end condition, which we've already designed similarly to address 45th Street, we could design lot 6 and lot 7 and lot 12 in a similar way. I don't think it makes sense for lot 12 because I like the fact that it approaches the street. So that one wouldn't make sense to me, but certainly lot 6 and 7, they could engage the open space a little bit more. We could have the walk come around, but again, I like the fact that these things front onto a street. But the reality is we could make those into 2-bedrooms fairly easily. We can make any of them into 2-bedrooms, but again, we're trying to address a variety of needs and issues here that our valley is experiencing. And our thought is that having a few more beds is better than trying to reduce them to 1- and 2-bedroom options. So.
And I really, as we kind of touched on in the last meeting, was that that actual makeup of those number of bedrooms, that aspect of it is not really what this committee is looking or charged with looking at. We're looking at the aesthetic characteristics and massing, looking at the building design for a variety of elements in the design, which looking at what you've done here, you've definitely in my mind, made some moves in the right direction to create a little bit more variety in those elevations between the two buildings. I still would like to see more articulation of, and maybe it's some more fenestrations on that 45th Street elevation. I know that, you've got a bonus room down there. You've got the ability to get some more, it seems at the pedestrian level, still seems a little bit solid wall there. And it would be nice if we could get more fenestration down at that lower level, since it's not garage at that level up against that wall plane. So there's some opportunity, I think, to get a little bit more there, make it a little bit friendlier at that lower elevation.
Okay. I think right now we have our unit, the stairs are along that edge, along this outside wall.
Maybe just getting a little bit more right there in that corner. You've got the big windows on the other end. So that was just a thought on that.
And just in terms of, let's just say, privacy on the landscape level. I feel like we would need, right now we've got some bigger shrubs there to, in at least provide some privacy, but leaving the fenestration for kind of the back of the unit.
So it looks like your landscape plan then doesn't even address the access to that unit, does it? Doesn't look like it.
It looks like they had it on the opposite side. It was here, and I think at one point we had a plan that had that in this location, and we decided to move it more towards the middle to make it more prominent. So this would just get updated to reflect that. But the connection is being made right here. At least what they were showing. We're intending that it be made here. So these shrubs would shift and this walk would shift. But as far as, providing some transparency or some fenestration on as many walls as we could, I'm not opposed to that. I would just be worried about some privacy there, and maybe some fence, some low fence, and planting material along there would help resolve some of that privacy concern.
And then I might just jump in because I know we're starting to get towards time constraints for committee member Gresham, and she had started to articulate some concerns, and I want to make sure that she's able to fully articulate those before she ends up having to leave.
Yeah, thank you. So, I do have concerns about the use of the PUD here. You're given a lot of latitude with the PUD, but in exchange, it is supposed to accomplish a lot more than what I'm seeing presented here. I think you could almost get away with doing this in the R3. So I just don't know that these waivers are appropriate. While we have in the past waived some of the parking, and I think totally appropriately, waiving two of them, that gives me a little, that gives me some concern that not only are we waiving the enclosed parking, we're also waiving the guest parking. So for me, it would be kind of an either or. And as one of the things or objectives with the PUD is to have useful patterns of open space, I do not feel that it is appropriate at all to waive the open space requirement. And I realize the applicant has said that they are achieving 10%. But if it comes back and it's only 8%, or if you wanted to use some of that for parking, I don't think that that would be appropriate. And I would not be in agreement with a waiver for that. Those are my comments.
I believe that we can meet the 10% requirement. I think that landscape is reflective of that, and we just need to update our number appropriately for the open space requirement with what we're showing here.
I also want to make one more point. I was not in your meetings with staff when they suggested a PUD might be an appropriate route for you to go. But I can almost guarantee you they didn't say that it was their decision, that they had the right. They suggested it as, if this is what you're wanting to do, this might be the appropriate route. But I can almost guarantee you they never gave any indication that this was going to be approved, or that you should be doing this. It is entirely up to the applicant to determine the course as appropriate for them.
100%. They did not indicate that anything would be approved. What we talked about was the strategy of this application, and the methods for which would need to be followed to get there. And the PUD was was the vehicle that seemed most appropriate for what our request was. So I apologize if I made the indication that it was staff that suggested this. It was through the discussions with staff during the required pre-application meeting that determined which option or which vehicle would be best appropriate for this particular application. So not guaranteeing any approval or denial, just that was what was discussed, and that's what's commonly discussed at pre-application meetings. In some ways, kind of the purpose. So we were again, if the roadblocks were determined far greater following just putting it into the zone. In terms of the PUD itself, you know, what's asked of us at this level for this particular application is fairly detailed information. So if the concern there is that we are going to, let's just say, bait and switch this application with information that's different, that is not at all the indication, because it wouldn't be allowed. We've already shown you what we're going to do here. So, you know, we're trying to provide an interesting development that we think is great for infill, and you know, this is our indication or attempt at what that is. And if something is going to be different, then we would have to come back to you for deviations to that. Or if somebody else was to come back to you for a different project, they would have to resubmit and modify their request. So this, you know, obviously with any conditions that you would impose upon us, we would accommodate those and make those adjustments. But we have every indication of providing this project on this site in the way that we're depicting it to you now. So from that regard, I don't believe that we have any reason to propose anything different on this site than what we're currently showing you.
I tend to like to address everything I've heard. Should it move forward for a recommendation? I'm hearing a recommendation for approval. It should have moved forward. I like to synthesize what I've heard. I'm hearing that perhaps there may be a condition that the elevations need to come back or meet certain standards, that there should be either it comes back or should be either an enclosed or a gust waiver, but not both, while not affecting open space. It should be noted that in what Mr. Wilmot showed us, there would need to be an additional waiver to allow for a 9x20 parking space rather than the 10x20. And I don't know that I feel like I heard direction on the fire truck turnaround, or just leave that to the fire department review. And a condition to update the landscape plan to match the site plan showing the access.
Jenna, just to clarify, the guest parking spaces are 9x20. These are 10x20.
Thank you.
So the way this is currently designed, these are compliant sizes. So just putting that out there.
So gentlemen, I do have to leave for another meeting. I'm not personally going to make a recommendation to move this forward. So if you guys want to do that, you need to do it now.
Is there enough things that we want to see it come back with some or all of them addressed?
I think what are your thoughts, Derek, on the enclosed and guest parking?
I think on a site like this with the constraints that they have, that the enclosed versus not enclosed doesn't bother me. But I hear the balance of asking for waivers for all the things that have to do with parking. So if the enclosed versus not enclosed is a waiver that they want, then it should meet the guest. If it meets the guest, you know, it's kind of pick one waiver and run with that one, but don't make everything to do with parking a waiver.
So we can have a motion to
Could satisfy guest parking and
yeah,
allow the waiver for outdoor parking of the required enclosed.
and then I guess if it does have to go through some significant changes based on fire truck access, it's going to be significantly, or it's going to be modified to where we're going to need to see it anyways. So
Yeah.
it would have to come back. So that can play out how it needs to play out.
And potentially the shoehorning guest parking in may require some significant redesign too.
And I guess I would be okay with staff reviewing some additional fenestration treatments on the 45th Street side. Wouldn't necessarily have to see I don't believe see another reiteration on the elevation of 45th.
And I'm going to every time, I think, hammer on the maximum choice of living environments. I hear what you're saying, Brett, that it's not in our purview, but I'm going to mention it and I'm going to talk about it every time because I think planning and zoning should be looking at that, and you know, staff should be looking at that as it comes along, and every applicant and every citizen of this city should be looking at that because it's important. You know, it's not just about bedroom counts all the time. It's about who's living in these projects, right? And different people live in 3 bedrooms than in studios in 1 bedroom. So I'm gonna keep bringing that up because it's in the staff report and it's written and it's a requirement. So whether it's in our purview or not, I'm gonna mention it.
That sounds good. I think it definitely is something that needs to be reiterated.
And I think the 10%, 8% thing, I think that's just a math thing that the applicant has figured out as far as open space. At this point, that's my understanding. So it's conditioned to be 10%, I think we can let that condition stand.
Okay, so then it looks like we've got, I guess I'll go ahead, I'll make the motion then. To approve with, let me see, what are the conditions that we have right now? In the, bring that up. Okay. With the conditions that the open space requirement is met and the vehicle guest parking requirement is met. And then recommending approval of the waiver on vehicle enclosed parking and the rear setback. I think that's.
Brett, what about the fenestration on the?
And the, additional fenestration at the ground level of the 45th Street facing unit on lot 1 be reviewed by staff.
I'll second that. And then just a little discussion to add to the, was that a little discussion to add to that rear setback? My comfort level with that comes from the fact that for all history, 45th Street has been the front yard. So that has been acting more like a side yard, right? It's kind of a letting that setback be the side setback that it's kind of historically been. That's how I got comfort level with going from 15 feet to 5 feet, just to add that to the record.
I also want to add to the record that the additional fenestration that will go to staff for the applicant to not cover that up with fencing and landscaping for privacy, because the whole point is to create a connection to the street. And fencing and landscaping over that would actually kind of counteract the whole purpose of doing it.
Agreed. I don't think, I don't see that there is proposed fencing on that front, and we don't.
Yeah, the applicant had just
approving
mentioned privacy concerns and maybe adding a fence. I'm like, well, no, that's kind of defeats the purpose. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear.
Okay.
So there's a motion and a second.
There is. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Nay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Maureen.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Have a good evening.
Yep, you too.
All right. I think we've actually already lost committee member Gresham. But is there a desire to return to the code amendment discussion?
Is Jeff Hatch here for a pre-app or no?
I never saw him come in.
Okay.
And we have some level of understanding that that's probably correct. Hannah did reach out to him earlier.
Okay.
If there's some specific things that maybe we didn't, that we need to drill into a little further, that were not discussed, or that Jason or Hannah want to discuss a little bit further, then I'd say that that's fine. We can do that for a little bit.
I mean, I think we want to make sure that we're getting whatever information you guys need to kind of have a better understanding of kind of the hurdles, and especially from the design review side, you know, because obviously this is going to go before design review, planning and zoning, and city council. So I think, you know, our concerns are what does design review think would make for, you know, because I know some of the things Jenah pointed out were maybe amenities, you know, whether that needs to be codified within the code, like, hey, you need to have these amenities for a tiny house community. You know, because I think what we've done with our design was made sure that the real amenity that we think is built into it is open space. You know, we've made it significantly less dense than what a mobile home park would be. And so there's going to be a significant amount of green space. And so there'll probably be some common areas that are going to be naturally built in, because you don't have enough tiny houses to fill the site as it's designed with that density. So, but we could, like I said, whether the code needs those extra things written into it, or whether it can just be up to the landowner that's designing this.
Well, I think that there's got to be some kind of framework set up for what that really looks like, to work within some parameters of, okay, well, what is this less dense community setting than an RV park? Well, what is that? What is that? How many units per acre? I mean, what are we really looking at when we talk about that?
I don't know, Brett, have you actually seen the code itself? Because we do have the densities in there.
Oh,
So I think, to give you an example, in the C2 zone, I think we've got it limited at 30 units an acre. And to kind of put that in perspective, because that doesn't really mean much, you know, you're kind of like, well, what does 30 tiny homes on an acre of property look like? But, you know, at 30 tiny homes at 400 square feet, right, is only like 12,000 square feet of site coverage for a 43,000 square foot site. And so that, I think, kind of maybe puts it in perspective of what that kind of looks like in terms of how the sites are covered.
And the goal is to create an open space community rather than create density.
I mean, I think it's both. I mean, the real truth is that 30 units on an acre is still a lot of people on an acre, right? I mean, assuming it's like either single or double occupancy of those tiny homes. I mean, in theory, we know some people who live with kids in tiny homes, but I would say that's probably going to be a very small minority. But you know, that's still a lot of people on a 1 acre site. So
I think that density allows for quality amenities really to take place that that we feel that was one of the things in the modern day communities. We need to make sure that quality amenities are accounted for.
Yeah. And I'd challenge you to look at, can you still get quality amenities in higher density? Or is higher density bumping up against, you know, community feedback and pushback that, hey, this is too dense?
Yeah.
You know, so where's that balance of, you know, more units, but still quality, you know, quality amenities? And is this, you know, are the proposals next to quality amenities that already exist, right? Is it next to the Greenbelt? Is it next to the Wave? Is it next to Expo Idaho, which may have, you know, how many ever acres of park? So is there some flexibility of 30 per acre, but hey, we're next to the Greenbelt, we're next to this canal pathway, we're next to Ladybird Park, so can we be a little bit denser? That's maybe a balance that you want to try to strike, and maybe providing examples of here's the Dallas community, and look at all these great amenities they have, and they are X per acre.
Yeah, good point. And we did imagine when we wrote this section of code, when we did the first draft, we did think about how it would lay out, so to speak. And so I just wanted to remind everybody, we did have a definition for tiny house code and things of that nature. And so some of that verbiage we've already really thought of. So hopefully you guys can really get the chance to digest that verbiage and now kind of think of it with the context of how it could be applied. And then, you know, like you said, what other words do we want to see?
Yep.
And then I might bring forward as proposed, it's proposed as a permitted use without design review. So it would be a staff level review. And so I would think that really laying out what the site would look like and the amenities might be a good idea if it goes through at a staff level at a permitted, because there's no oversight except for what code says. And so if it says this is our density, but somebody huddles it up towards, you know, a corner of a site and then they leave the rest of it fallow, the staff would have no recourse to try to push for it.
Sure.
And I had a couple notes just as I went through. Some are super technical, but just maybe think about them now or answer now or whatever, but I'll just go through those just so you have those in your mind, you know, for context for later. Question is, why limit it to C2 and M? Is that because that's what's already allowed with RVs and mobile home parks?
Yeah, so for clarification, that was one of my 2 points for the record that I wanted to, well, this is an actual meeting. I can't get my mind around that. There's no official record, but we wanted to propose it to C2 and R3, not the R20 zone. That's a staff report, or the M zone reflects.
Okay, but why not?
That's a great theory.
I mean, there really aren't any M zone properties. I mean, I would say that's probably the first reason. I mean, you could make it in there too, but it's not going to really affect any properties.
Okay.
I mean, the real truth is, if you look at the properties that are on the east end of the city that have empty properties where I think there's some availability and where there wouldn't be any opposition to this, it makes sense to have it in that C2 and R3. I mean, one, like I said, with C2, it's RV parks are already allowed. The R3, you already have trailer parks that are allowed. And so mobile home parks, you know, obviously, like Charlie said, the only place in Idaho that's approved tiny homes in RV parks and mobile home parks. And so we're saying, hey, well, there we go. We're already allowed for these zones.
Right. Okay. And then two, like the high limit and the low limit, I questioned, you know, there was a not greater than 600 square feet. Why not? And there was a not less than 120 square feet. And I questioned why not?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think we actually pulled that definition, and I think it was at 400 square feet. And we pulled that definition because that's how most other codes are now defining tiny homes on wheels.
Right.
And I think it's because, you know, the limitations of a tiny house on wheels, I think it's our mind that what makes it a tiny house is that it's easily movable. You know, so we saw earlier this year, one of the mobile home parks that got taken down for the boardwalk development. You know, a number of people live there, were trying to move their mobile homes. And I think what we saw was that only one person out of that whole development was able to move a mobile home out of there. And it's only because they GoFundMe and raised like $10,000 to get it moved. And so I think the idea is that if it costs $10,000 to move it because it's, 15 feet wide, then all of a sudden it's not really mobile. That's a much more permanent structure to us.
Yeah.
And so these tiny homes are something that can be moved with a 1-ton pickup truck.
Right. Makes sense.
And so in our mind, when you get over 400 square feet, it starts to not actually be movable in the same way. And I think that it probably is something else.
Especially if it's, let's move this every 90 days or 6 months or every year.
Right.
It's going to be
Yeah.
Because I think that's what the city's going to have to figure out, is what they're comfortable with, to say, hey, this is kind of here semi-permanently. Because again, Idaho law doesn't say, hey, you have to move it every 90 days. And so the city's going to have to come up with how often do they want these tiny homes moved? And I think we hope that it's going to be less often, but even if it's once a year, they're going to need to be movable.
Yeah.
At least until Idaho at some point directly addresses tiny houses.
Sure.
Yeah. And there was also something in there said with at least one closet. I think that in tiny homes and in designing tiny homes, it's always like, why can't I just get an armoire that's going to serve the same purpose? And most tiny home designs are going to use every square inch of storage as they can. So that seems like something that some plan reviewer is going to look at and then try to define what a closet is. And
sure,
I just get rid of that.
Derek, I actually agree, because I looked at the what we call the Appendix Q, and it didn't reference, the outline of Appendix Q, even though it's for on slab built, it doesn't reference closet.
Right.
It reference loft, height, square footage, things that are viable. But I think closet, again, is a gray area.
Yeah.
Well, and I think I only left it in because I saw it in another code, and I think that every tiny house has a bunch of storage spaces all built all around inside of them.
Right.
Not what you would consider a traditional closet, though, most times.
Right. And so I think what we're going to have to do is understand that there's some flexibility within that, because what we're working with is something that doesn't exist. It's like I said, it's in this gray area because it's, a little outside the box.
But I mean, for the sake of achieving our affordability goals and, the goals of the comprehensive plan, that we want to have a diversity in housing and we want to accomplish affordability for workforce, I think this is something that moves us in that direction.
And in all of this defining and, inventing words and then defining those words that we're inventing, is it easier to just change the RV code? Just change the RV park code to be something smaller that works for this, and then your tiny house on wheels are RVs and they can go into this park.
I think that's a wonderful theory, Derek. I really do, because.
But does that then make more RV parks with 1970s RVs that maybe aren't as desirable?
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why I think we're going this route first, is that I think the reality is that the city doesn't really want to see a big giant 3-acre RV park.
And I do think this code is stricter and provides a good framework for more restrictions and a better layout. I think this, again, provides a framework for a quality site plan and just, again, that quality sense of community that we want to create.
Right. But then that brings me back to a question I had earlier of what's the difference between a mobile home like 3 blocks that way in an existing 1950s mobile home park and what we're looking at, a tiny house on wheels circa 2022. Like, what's the difference between those two things without using the words cool and Instagram? Right?
400 square feet.
That's what it is.
Well,
it's the size of that thing and the mobility of that
And
thing.
how it's regulated.
Right.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly. And us proposing, or the city proposing, that we put this definition in code. We start saying Sure, you can classify it as an RV, but there is a definition of tiny house communities. And while we say a tiny house is classified as an RV, not every RV will be classified as a tiny house. That's the big, I think that's the big difference. And like Brett said, it's how they're, you know, it's RV, I'm sorry, I always get that RVIA certified. It's the certifications and the,
I do have a question on that, akin to Derek's question. Instead of mobile homes, what's the designation between an RV and a tiny home? I mean, is it exterior treatments? Is it that it's not mass produced? And more and more tiny homes on wheels are being mass produced. So if somebody comes in with a standard RV and you look at it and you know it's an RV, this is a permitted use, and they say, well, no, it's a tiny home. How would the city administer that and know the difference between the two?
yeah, that's a great question, Jenna. I think if we had to pick one thing that we would say, no, it's an RV versus an actual tiny house. I do think it's size primarily.
I mean, I think it's the type of construction too.
Yeah, and type of construction. I agree. Size and type of construction.
So, I mean, I think that what makes tiny homes more appealing to people and seemingly more permanent is that they use traditional construction methods for regular housing.
Like the type of stud, right? Correct?
Yeah,
Could we
type
not?
of stud, but also the fixtures are all regular fixtures, you know, and RVs are significantly differently. You know, they're insulated differently. Like I said, all the values are lower, whereas a tiny home is insulated just like your house is.
But what's the one thing that the one mechanism that the city could lean on for what is that item? Is it construction?
I think it's traditional construction methods.
Okay.
for normal-
Traditional construction methods reflected in and then code is cited or something of that nature.
Because I mean, I think the thing that I've learned is the city obviously is going to be able to interpret their code however they want. And so the truth is nobody's fooled when you look at an RV versus a tiny house. Nobody's fooled that any RVs are tiny houses. From the eye test, anybody can tell the difference.
Sure, but again, just finding that verbiage, traditional construction methods by reference of IRC.
It would almost be nice if you could really quantify what that is from like an energy code compliance. I mean, R values in walls and the roof and so on and so forth, so that you had really some criteria that was allowed for a lot of flexibility in what the overall aesthetic looks like, but like a certain performance that you can't get from an RV,
Right.
Yeah,
a traditional RV.
a good idea.
And I think you're right, Brett. You know, but when we've looked at the other examples, and what we'll do for the next time, we'll actually pull some examples of what the other cities have done. And I think as we looked at all the examples of what everybody else did, again, they kind of just said, look, this is a tiny house and this isn't. And again, kind of it's just this idea that you can look at it and tell, because like I said, tiny houses have 2x4 construction, you know, and some of those simple things, like I said, the R values are actually like a house rather than like an RV, you know, and so, like I said, I think that when we looked at what we wrote as our definition was based on some other cities and how they defined it. Because like I said, it's kind of hard to go too far, because then you may be, you know, the whole reason tiny houses exist is because people were thinking outside the box, kind of doing some stuff. And so you don't want to try to budget in where somebody's going to be looking at it and going, oh, that doesn't meet this little tiny piece of the definition.
And pretty much are they always towable and not built on a chassis frame?
Always.
So I mean, you would eliminate all of your, you know, RVs and motor homes that are self-drivable, so to
Yes.
speak, or driven versus towed.
Absolutely.
Well, and like I said, size almost eliminates a lot of those anyway,
Yeah.
you know, so that's, I think the nice thing is that the size kind of, it gets rid of the mobile home pieces of everything because they're always bigger. And then, like I said, on the RV side, they're on wheels, but they're not actually motorized.
Just so it's been said, people will take a traditional 1970s RV and put siding on it and asphalt roof on it so they can go into one of these tiny home developments.
I was just gonna say, with the big, but the square footage would eliminate the super large toy haulers with just reskinning the outside of them.
Right.
I agree. I think size would be the thing that we're pretty locked in, you know. A loft will pretty much clear out that idea.
Well, and
I mean, again, it's hard to say because you're right. There's
in
some
my
crafty
mind, the
stuff.
hope is that, you know, obviously this could be changed in the future as we understand what people are going to do better. But I think the hope is that you create the ability to actually use some underutilized property right now to have some development that people really aren't opposed to, and that will add some affordable solutions for some workforce housing, especially like in that C2 zone. You know, we've talked to some brewery owners and restaurant owners, and they all are having trouble finding people to work. It's because people can't even live here anymore. And so, you know, having the ability to live where you work is going to add some significant advantage for Garden City, for businesses, for the people who are living here. And like I said, having that as something that's super affordable as an option that isn't an RV, because right now the most affordable option is literally living at the Expo Idaho site in an RV. And there's a lot of people who choose to do that. And so right now in that C2 zone, that could be an option. You know, a 3-acre property could be turned into a giant RV park. And a whole bunch of people could then basically be living in their RVs, and they could move every 3 months. They could drive away and then come back. But I think that's not as good of an option as kind of taking the tiny house idea. And even if it's constricted right here at first, like kind of tight, where we're going, 400 square feet. So it's 410, that's too big. Constricting it so that what we get is going to be really good, because like I said, we don't want it to look like a trailer park, because people have a problem with trailer parks. Even if they don't want to say they do, lots of people don't like it, and part of it is because they feel packed in and kind of crazy. And so I think we're trying to, you know, maybe we could get more density, but I think we don't want to do that just yet.
And again, I think we know people are living in RVs. We know RV park exists. We want to provide a better quality solution in a semi-permanent housing crisis environment. And we want to provide a solution that people have an additional option, that they're not being criminalized for living, you know, that we can go to people and say, look, there are tiny houses. You need to buy something that provides you a quality of life.
Well, I think that definitely looking at some of these other aspects of it in regards to, you know, how's parking handled and drive aisles and the site layout, you know, is it almost something that type of a community with the tiny houses gives you some different opportunities that you wouldn't have in an RV type setting. With some of those might even be that, okay, parking is not at each unit. You know,
Yeah.
Parking is centralized. The actual lot or the configuration of the tiny houses is more centered around open space and accessed via pedestrian and bike connectivity, and not but still giving yourself, a way to get those towed in and towed out and positioned. But doing some things like that and how you set the parameters up with what we want these things to be really is going to help give them their own identity and set it apart from what is traditionally thought of as kind of an RV park, even from the standpoint of when those are going into these C2 locations and what the surrounding uses are and this perception of what this is going to be,
Yeah.
So just kind of exploring some of those things and addressing those in specific provisions in the code, I think is a good idea, and not just leave it, pie in the sky. We'll figure it out during the application process, and each one's going to get looked at without, really kind of honing in on what those parameters are.
Well, and Brett, to kind of answer that, I think what we did to do this was we started by designing a tiny house community. And so one of the things that's in that code is that we wanted the parking separated from the housing, meaning like it's actually independent. I mean, you could still have the parking space next to each tiny house if you want, but the parking, I think, our goal was that the parking was actually separated from the spaces themselves, meaning you could get a space that didn't have parking if you wanted it.
I think it just creates a unique opportunity to have, let's just say, like a Grass Creek Drive that
Totally.
wraps through there, that you can get in and get the tiny house positioned, and then the parking occurs in a designated location, and it's really just creating this unique environment that it could be something really special and therefore very different than an RV type setting.
Sure. And I think that's what we kind of try to do without saying it. In other words, look, I imagine that somebody on their property may want to have the parking right next to their tiny house because that's how people are. And I think that's okay if they want to do that. But I think what we designed originally that we then wrote the code for was something where parking was actually separated and parking was altogether separated, so that, somebody who's, say, renting a space on that site would rent that parking as a separate space, so that they were actually disconnected from each other. In other words, if you didn't have a car, you wouldn't have to rent a parking space.
And that's our big push to encourage buy an e-bike,
right?
Buy a $2,000 e-bike.
And so I think that's what we kind of tried to include. I think the question, though, that maybe is for you is, did we do enough with that? Or should we spell it out? Say, look, the parking has to be separate. The parking, because like I said, we have disconnected. I think within that code, we disconnected the parking from the spaces themselves for tiny houses, because when we look at a tiny house, in theory, a parking space with the space to pull out of a parking space takes up, I think, 330 square feet. So that's going to actually take up more space than almost the people's entire house. So the question is, do you really want, 12,000 square feet of the 1 acre site is going to be tiny houses? Do you really want the other 12,000 square feet taken up parking? And then you have, you basically reduced your open space by a good bit.
I would suggest that perhaps you don't require that parking separated, because I think you're going to run into ADA issues potentially as well.
Okay.
But ADA isn't specifically addressed in the proposal, nor do I know any federal codes that would specifically.
You can use words like encourage, and that'll help sway the.
And then it's not really a design question, but it is a question because the intent is for affordability. So are there any mechanisms to attempt to reduce the ability for predatory for lack of a better word, landowner really taking advantage of individuals that are trying to live in the community.
So we actually kind of started with affordability, and that was our big goal, is how do we introduce affordability into the market? That was the goal. The tiny houses was an aftermath of, it was the only product that was, what, Jason, 28% AMI. It was the
Well,
absolute only
So
item that exists.
Portland just did a citywide code rewrite that now allows for like duplexes and fourplexes and a whole
ADUs.
variety of types of ADUs. And so then there were some studies on how affordable were those options and which of those options were actually going to get built. And half of the things Portland approved couldn't even be built at the current high prices that people already can't afford. And so of the half of the things that people could afford, the only thing that actually hit people who were below 50% AMI was tiny houses on wheels.
The only thing.
The only thing that was even close to affordable to people at 50% AMI, which is for us, that would be like somebody making $20 an hour. And so when you look at that math and you go, okay, somebody making $20 an hour, the only thing they're going to actually be able to afford that only
Is a
takes
tiny
up
house on wheels.
33% of their salary is going to be a tiny house on wheels. That was the only thing that was the actual truly affordable option. And so we said, I mean, it seems like it's a no-brainer that it should be allowed. Portland has figured out a way to allow them everywhere now. So you can put them anywhere in the city as ADUs, but also in little parks. And so we're kind of going, hey, it would make sense for us to start to look at this now early so we can kind of figure out what we need to mentally grasp what it's going to take to get there.
And I think, Jenna, that brings up a good point, and something that I think about with, a traditional mobile home park versus this tiny house on wheels is traditional mobile home park. They cost a lot of money to get in there, and then inherently they cost a lot of money to take away. So, these people have been living in a mobile home, paying the lot rental fee and paying the mortgage on their mobile home. And then when they find themselves in different circumstances and they have to move, they don't have $10,000 to move the actual mobile home, which in this case, I think the tiny house on wheels, you find a friend with a big truck and away it goes. So I think that's a way that this is maybe different and helping that affordability, because when, someone with a tiny house on wheels finds itself in a different circumstance, or they need to move to Portland, or they need to move to Dallas, they find a friend with a big truck and they take their home with them, rather than, the limited options that people have. They need to find another slot in a mobile home park to take a mobile home. And it costs a lot of money to move a mobile home, but I think these inherently are ready to be moved at any point, unlike a traditional mobile home.
And I think that is the idea. So, I mean, I think when I look at it, like I said, one of the neighbors over there at the Boardwalk project, it cost, I think it was just under $9,000 to actually move the trailer itself. And then there were other expenses on top of that.
And that was probably within a 5-mile radius.
Oh, it was still here in Garden City. It was 4 blocks.
Not across the country, which you could do with it.
Yeah, it was just a few blocks that it got moved. And so I think what we see as maybe at least the part that maybe eliminates the predatory side of it is just this, that let's say the landowner is got his little tiny house community and he goes, I'm going to raise your rent from $500 a month to $700 a month. Those people in the tiny homes, now they can go, I'm moving to Expo Idaho RV Park. And that actually is an option for them. And it's an option that doesn't actually cost them any money. It literally is the gas that it takes to get over there in your truck. And so I think in our mind, that's one advantage of kind of having this, where it's still not permanent and they're movable, because again, there's going to be actually, if this code gets passed, there's going to be more places that people can legally live in these. And again, if I don't think there's actually opposition to people living in tiny homes. And so, there's going to be these other areas of town where people can live. We see plenty of underutilized property where this can happen. So I think that's the thing that's going to discourage what kind of see now, which is like every apartment building is raising their rents like enormously. So, and the truth is it's hard to get out of your apartment because you have all your stuff. It takes time. Same thing with the trailer parks. If they raise their rent $400 next month, the people wouldn't really have an option to do anything.
And then one other food for thought that from my perspective, I guess, is in the discussion of semi-permanent, if they're having to move every 90 or 180 days, to the administration side of it. So is there an additional code section like licensing or something that would need to be implemented to track those?
I mean, I think our hope is that the city will look at that timeline and look at it more on a yearly basis. Because again, I think there's nothing in Idaho code that says, oh, you got to make them move every 90 days. And I think what we're saying is, look, these tiny homes are more permanent than RVs. So they shouldn't be held to the same standard that RVs are being held to, which is that if an RV park were proposed in Garden City would want them moved every 90 days. But within Garden City code right now, I don't see any licensing stuff that would make that happen either. I mean, I guess that's what I don't see how Garden City would enforce the 90-day thing on RVs right now. So I'm not sure that.
I mean, I think that maybe, a document that says it's RVIA certified and, acknowledgement of you need to keep your home in tow, the in tow process. And, if the city says, okay, once every 2-year period, you need to do a move, you need to justify a move, and then here's the parameters accordingly as to what that looks like. And so, I mean, again, I do think it's based on what the city's comfort level is on the time. I mean, I think the move out quickly, move back in, some of this becomes more of, we know they need to stay in tow, but what's the good timeline to make it a community, but not have it be tedious?
Yeah, I would question, well, a couple things. What's the benefit of it driving around the block once a year, once every 9 months or whatever? What's the benefit of that? And then, do mobile home RVs have registration stickers? So we know they're mobile, we know they're getting their license plates updated or whatever, but mobile homes also do have a sticker, right? Aren't those recertified every so often? So, I mean, something like, what's the balance between, if it's an RV, is there a certification sticker? And then, potentially if there's no benefit in this thing moving around the block once a year, once every 6 months, whatever it is there a benefit of, someone from, development services, an inspector coming and looking them all at the same time? Like, can it be a park approval that says, okay, I see this is still a tiny home. They haven't modified it in some way that makes it not movable, or modified it in some way and added 6 stories to it. Those sorts of things. Like, yes, this park still looks like it was intended to be, and all of these homes look like they were intended to be. And it's just kind of a global thing, rather than, oh, that one's going to move next week. Everybody put your cars aside. And then, what's that look like in reality? It could be, more beneficial that they don't drive around the block every year.
And I appreciate that, but I still think even if it's once every 5 years, a park submits all their paperwork, there likely need to be a licensing component to that, or some sort of component where the administration could be administered, instead of being like, oh, staff, today you pick and choose and you just go and you drive around and you figure out and try to identify if these are semi-permanent in nature. And so I think it would be my suggestion that the administration, there be something, some sort of log or registration of part of those communities. Or
Well,
even-
and I like what you said, Jenna, that the park has to submit its, even if it's an annual report, you know, the park has to submit, even if it's a photo of everybody on the day or the day before, the week before that report is due. It's okay to say, hey, park as a whole, whoever that owner is, needs to submit a report. And here's XYZ. I mean, I don't, you know, has there been modifications to any of the units? Has any construction occurred on the site? Whatever that case is, just a report. I think that's.
Well, and I think we're open to that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's something that makes sense, because I think in my mind there is some advantage to moving them around, which is that if you're keeping them on wheels, the wheels should be rotated anyway, and they can be rotated without moving them. But it also makes sense, like I said, that they are still traveling tiny houses and that they aren't just like, you know, collapsed on the ground and just laying there. But I guess what I'm saying is, like, within the RV code, I didn't see any licensing stuff. In other words, there's nothing that the city requests from RV parks to say, hey, your RVs are moving every 90 days.
Or that they're even registered.
And so if I had an example of what the city wants, which, like I said, we looked in the RV code to see if there was an example of that, we could just modify that and say, hey, you do the same thing for tiny houses. And so this might be a chance for the city to kind of say what they would like to see in terms of, maybe also in terms of the RV parks. You know, because again, we don't really know what documentation the city needs to see to be comfortable with what that looks like. Because right now they're telling RVs that they have to move every 90 days, but there's no actual way that gets enforced.
But I like that point about the park having the responsibility to put this document out versus, oh, it's on staff, you know, it's up to you. So I see that being a benefit. I mean, we're happy to attempt a creation, but if there's something that staff or any committee would like to see, again, this is open to it.
Yeah, I mean, because
Oh,
I
sorry.
haven't seen other cities do that. But like I said, some of the other cities that have allowed it now, like Moscow, for example, they don't make them move. So they're allowing them to be permanently set down, and there's no like time frame that they have to be moved. And so they're really, in Idaho, there's no example of it. And then other cities that have now legalized them, they're also not making them move. And so it's, like I said, if we feel like we need to make a move to meet Idaho law, then that's fine. And I think we can come up with some solution, but I think it would maybe be helpful if the staff kind of gave us a little bit of what you wanted there.
Sure,
You know,
I
if
think
it's,
that's easy. Just so the specifics, I'm not gonna off the cuff that, but Title III has licensing.
okay.
Perfect. Thank
Yeah,
you.
we'll take a look at that.
And then,
Was any other thoughts? Sorry, go ahead.
no, just a quick question. Are RV parks, is there a general common like mail room and everyone has like spot number 2, they get their mail there, spot number 3? And what are your thoughts on that? Is each one an individual address?
The U.S. Postal Service won't, well, meaning there will be a gang station, meaning unit 1 through whatever. you wouldn't have individual addresses based on the fact that it's not going through the subdivision process for legal addressing.
So it
Well-
all gets dumped into one box.
You could have unit, you could
Yeah,
say,
So
5.
just like trailer parks. So trailer
Okay.
parks, you have a bunch of trailers on the site, but then the mailbox is at the front and they have just separate little,
Got it.
they're all the same address. you
Got it.
know.
So these individuals living there would have regular permanent addresses in essence.
I mean, it's our thought that that would make the most sense. You know, right now, like the Expo Idaho RV park, those people live there permanently, but they don't actually get their mail there. You know, so they basically all have to have a PO box at the post office right there. And that's how they actually get their mail. So in our mind, it would make sense to have, you know, I think it's our thought that this wouldn't be like a whole bunch of Airbnb tiny houses. You know, I mean, not that you couldn't do it, but I think that's not the purpose of why we're proposing this. So, you know, certainly I think in our mind, it would make sense for the little tiny house community to be able to get mail and to have some separate boxes.
Well,
was there any other items, or could we chat about next steps? I guess I'm always, based on that it's a, just a discussion item. I do find it, I think it would be beneficial to circle back with design review committee after we take all these notes and put them all together and also find detail specifics of ordinances. I mean, that's a big one.
And then you chat with planning and zoning before you'd have a chance to even have another discussion with us too. So
So, because I think I have 3 pages of notes. I think it's going to be good to get their comments and then put everything together. So in the instance that we're like, hey, planning and zoning also wanted XYZ, by the time we circle back to you, we can address those and show you what, I mean, there could be something that nobody is even considering. So I think that's appropriate. We go to P&Z on Wednesday, and then we'll schedule an additional meeting back to design review, compile everything, see where we are. And, you know, again, just keep the conversations with staff and the legal process. If there's anything additional we need to look at, happy to do so.
Yeah. Because we haven't actually made any changes to the code, even from the staff comments. So, you know, obviously we've got all the staff comments that we can make some changes to, and then what we've heard today.
I have a suggestion. And
Yeah.
separate the requirements for the tiny homes and the tiny home communities. So for example, you could potentially add an 84B5, a residential design standard for a tiny home itself.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
then have a tiny home community instead of trying to address those standards, and then they're not addressed if it's an ADU, right? So you've got some disconnect there. And then you're correct. Wednesday, it'll be going to P&Z, and then next Monday to City Council. And I would suggest that the hearings that are scheduled for next month be bumped out another month and go through this discussion process again, because there's an awful lot there. We spent a lot of time today just discussing legalities and safety standards, and we didn't really dive into specifics of what's proposed for site design, et cetera. I mean, we have a little bit at the end, but there may be quite a few additional comments, I suspect, from the committee after they see a revision. And so my hunch is, if it's okay with the applicant, we'll push towards another work session with the revised documentation.
Yeah, we would definitely be for that.
Yeah. Jenna, other than that breakout, because that's a really good, clean way of tiny houses versus tiny house community versus the ADU component in general. But do you see any other organizational things?
Yeah, I think the staff report on points of discussion, there's
Okay.
some kind of regulatory things that found their way into definition and maybe pulling that back out and putting it in like the regulations and leaving the definition, you know, like just strictly definition. And then as noted, potentially looking at Title III, if there's, you know, some sort of documentation that should be licensing versus the land use side of things. And I mean, it could be simple, like that it's in compliance with land use codes, you know, if the licensure, they end up having to move, et cetera. Organization, can you think of any organization stuff?
I think it might be the right time too, to, you know, we have tiny house on wheels definition, ADU, define tiny house in general. Because I can see, you know, in my mind, I'm picturing this tiny house on wheels development. And in my mind, I can take those wheels off and put them on foundations and may want to see that sort of development too. So is this the time to define tiny houses, period, not just tiny houses on wheels?
I think they're defined actually in Garden City Code.
Yeah.
Are they not, Jenna?
They're not.
I mean, I think they're already allowed. That's
Allowed,
what
but not defined. So maybe with this definition, you can make the same development, strip the wheels and add concrete.
I mean, I think you could already do the development. that we're
Okay.
saying. In other words, I think that if, you know, looking at our site design and our layout, I believe you could actually, if you were doing this on a foundation, I think it could already be done.
Okay.
And
There
we wouldn't
may-
even be having this talk.
Okay, there may be some of
Yeah.
the size things and closet things, and you know, you have to have this many square feet to call it living space and
Yeah.
head height. There's some of
Well, I
those
think
sorts of things.
I actually think the only thing that couldn't is the only reason this couldn't be done right now in Garden City is simply parking regulation.
Okay, okay,
You know, and again, you know, that's going to be the big question. If you have a tiny house that's only 270 square feet, do you really want to use, you know, 200 square feet more for a garage? Because that's really,
Right.
I think, where technically the communities that we designed really couldn't be done in Garden City, because right now you have to have parking spaces that are enclosed. And so I think that's where it's maybe really it couldn't be done. You know, I would
Yeah.
assume that these would probably be considered like studios.
which I guess is maybe my point, is then, you know, 3 of these developments go up that you're proposing, that you have in your mind, and then someone's like, I want to do that, but I want to make them permanent because I want to sell them, you know, as its
Mhm.
own little individual lot. And then they're like, well, this is silly. We can't do this just like they're doing it because we don't have
Right.
wheels.
Right.
I think you absolutely can. And most of like the language or the ideas that we implemented in this code literally was from Garden City's, like, you know, landscape and
Right,
street.
right.
Well, I think the only reason that we don't want to do more, Derek, is maybe the worry that this is kind of a test run through.
Yep.
You know, I mean, the truth is these little 400 square foot tiny house on wheels, there's not going to be 200 of these in Garden City, right? I mean, even if this code passes, I think we'll be lucky to see 50. But it's something that should be allowed for the people that want it. For those 50 people that would like to live in a tiny house, it's not something that shouldn't be allowed.
With
And so
25% AMI.
I think that the big thing comes down to, if let's say this works and it's not a crazy burden to the neighbors and everybody goes, hey, that actually was kind of neat, then the discussion can be had about, hey, look, that only had, you know, half a parking space for every unit. And a lot of people didn't need parking because they were in the commercial zone, right where they were working down at the brewery. And so people came in who really were at the bottom of the income ladder and were able to get a little house and they could live there cheap. And we might then be able to say, hey, we should be able to build a little, like I saw the picture of the house you designed as an ADU in Boise. And obviously, if you had to attach a parking garage to that, it wouldn't have made sense. And so I think those discussions can happen afterwards when this either works or it doesn't work and people go, we're never doing that again. That's kind of my thought is part of the reason that we're containing it so much and making it strict is because we don't want it to end up like an RV park. Because we think that if this was a giant, like I said, the city allows for a 3-acre RV park in this zoning. And so we think if that happened, people would be like, why the hell would the city allow an RV park here? And so I guess what we want is something that's better than that and kind of safe at first. But like I said, I think that over time we could look back at this code and if it needed to be modified to be a little less safe, I think that could happen.
Well, and again, I think not safe, but the city can expand on the parameters to build upon the foundation of this code.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, I think this was really
All
good
right.
feedback. Thank you, guys. That was a lot to digest, but I think we have some work. So Jenah, are you good with those meeting notes?
Yeah,
I
we'll
mean-
finalize the notes. You'll probably hear synthesis a bit on Wednesday. Yeah. And then this is getting up on YouTube, right? So, and this meeting will also get up on YouTube. So
Oh, awesome. That's great.
we can do that.
Yeah, perfect.
So we'll attend Wednesdays and then we'll circle back.
Okay, sounds great.
Hey,
Awesome.
thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
You too.
Yeah, bye.
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 Thank you. We'll work through the logistics. And then for committee members, I don't know, do you have a few more minutes in you?
Yep.
All right, I do apologize. Do we have it in here? Let's see. So I wanted to share with you, there's a bit of a snafu on the split rail winery sidewalk, where they poured the sidewalk as an attached sidewalk. And staff has been going back and forth with them to try to come up with a solution, considering that they already have a poured sidewalk in place. It looks like it's taking a second to and just go like this, like that. So what they've proposed, and I can show you the original configuration, but back here on 32nd Street, close to Osage, they had never had like a greatly detached sidewalk. It looks like maybe there were a couple of feet, with the trees always being on the property side, not the roadway side. And what they have right now, it's our understanding, is a 7-foot sidewalk instead of a 5-foot sidewalk. And then over here, they've proposed cutting out the sidewalk and installing the trees where they were proposed and approved by design review, but leaving the sidewalk in place and just doing a curve around the trees. And they really wanted to keep some of that greenery in place, and that's why they didn't propose doing a full sidewalk where you can see some of the greenery that they've left in place.
So do you have what went through DR shot?
And so this is what the original was, where you can see that there was that detached sidewalk with street trees.
Okay.
And then here you can see there was that detached sidewalk as well with a 5-foot sidewalk. And then we weren't quite sure on the dimensions, but we were thinking that's probably 2.5 feet for the landscape strip.
So at what point did it go from detached to attached? If this is what was approved through design review, I'm taking it.
This is the original approval where you can see that there's a straight landscape buffer with street trees and then the sidewalk. And then what was installed was the attached sidewalk, but at a greater, so instead of 5 feet, at 7 feet back here. And then
So they just paved the entire landscape strip is what happened.
correct. And then we, in working with them, they've proposed coming back and not having the trees on the other side of the sidewalk, but back, cutting tree grates or tree wells into the sidewalk and then adding more concrete. So there's still the 5-foot sidewalk around those.
Gosh. Jenna, can you pull that other one back up, please? Okay, so what are they doing on that other corner? Then
I'm
just-
sorry.
If you can just pan down to the Osage corner, the other direction. So what are they doing over there? Nothing. That's basically just an attached sidewalk.
Mhm.
What it does is, how do we allow this to happen and then not have it create the for everybody developing, on down the street, they've got an attached sidewalk now.
Yeah, or
From a
they,
code compliance standpoint, because they've got an attached sidewalk on one side, they can have an attached sidewalk, which is not what we want.
yeah, or worst case, people just build it how they want to and then say, oh, we're sorry, here's a solution.
And we talked through that as staff, and I think we came to the conclusion that the property on the other side of what would be this property right here
Mhm.
does not have sidewalk. I think that's what we discussed. Do you want to share your screen? Thanks. And so it wouldn't have attached on both sides. So the policy would allow for the detached still.
Oh, is that, it has to have attached on both sides in order to,
That's correct, yeah.
okay.
So,
But the policy on this one says it's detached.
yes, yeah. The approval and the policy says that this particular development would be a detached sidewalk and it was poured as an attached.
So call ACOR.
I don't know. I just don't understand, with a set of permitted site civil drawings, which I would presume would have been designed as the detached, which was what was approved in order to get through permitting, that we ended up with something that is that much different. And now we're trying to find a workaround. So,
Yeah, it went from design review approval to someone drawing then the landscape plans and not reading, ignoring intentionally or not the.
Was that the case, or is this the proposed fix because what was permitted did not get constructed? Or did what was permitted get constructed?
So no, but the plans do show, so it wasn't permitted, but the plans do show it as attached in the building permit. And what had happened was the plan review had indicated that it needs to adhere to the design review approvals. But there are the site plans that do contradict the design review approvals.
Oh,
The site plans were drawn after the design review approval though. So whoever drew the site plans didn't read the design review approval. Is that correct?
well,
That would be correct. But
well, we would have saw some civil site design in our review as well.
But maybe not the ones that are finalized that then go to permitting. Right, if it's, we may see something that's attached and we condition it as detached. And then drawings are made to go to get a building permit that may or may not have read through and caught that condition.
we do have this, the other, you can't see that anyway. We do have the original approval showing the detached sidewalk is the approved design review set of plans. And then I don't know what happened on the other side, how it got redrawn and submitted into the building permit, contrary to that.
Well, I don't feel comfortable because it got constructed incorrectly, that now we're going to need to adjust our approval or approve something that we wouldn't otherwise have approved.
Yeah, a financial hardship isn't ours to determine. Like, yeah, it costs money to tear things out and do it over, but that doesn't change all the criteria that led up to it being the way it was approved.
So am I hearing that a full strip, or should we have them come in with a proposal unless they can go back to the exact? I'll show this.
I mean, quite honestly, I would like to see detached sidewalk on there, like was approved with the landscape strip adjacent to the street.
All right.
And is that landscape strip, it looks like 2 feet, but I don't know if there was ever any dimensions on there or anything, or I don't know what the actual street profile would say it should be. But 2 feet seems narrower than we've ever approved.
I don't know that you can get the trees in a 2 foot.
I'm wondering if that may be what happened at the building permit. Because you're correct, it's far less than 5 feet, and typically ACHD with root barrier will require 6 feet and without 8 feet. And so as approved, I think they're going to have a hard time trying to get that through ACHD. And I don't know that we ever had the dimensions. Oh. And Hannah's saying she doesn't think so. Can I share that?
Do you have easily accessible the, design review? Because I remember there was renderings and stuff. We looked a lot at that
Yeah, we did.
sidewalk streetscape and how it interacted and how bicycles were going to interact with the people in the patio and all that sort of stuff. And there was definitely landscaping there. I don't remember it being a little 2-foot strip.
So I think what happened was the rendering showed a much larger landscape buffer between the street and the sidewalk that they proposed. And then they also had a much taller sound buffer fence, like CMU fence, without landscaping in front of it. What was I going to share? So this was the original landscape plan approval.
Through DR.
Approved through DR, yes. And then I can pull up the renderings and other site plans. They're still on our website under their application, if you guys want to look at those.
Yeah, I don't see a dimension there either. It does say that the sidewalk is 5 feet, but it doesn't say how wide that strip is.
Right, so that's why we're guessing it's about 2 feet, because if the sidewalk is accurate,
Yeah.
showing 5 feet, it looks less than that.
Yeah, but it looks more than half of that. So maybe it's 2.5 or 3. Can you scroll out just a touch? Oh yeah, 7 is that screen wall.
It's that screen wall, and then they've got, oh, it looks like a good 6 feet or 5 feet or so of landscaping in front of that screen wall. You know, so I don't know if they've got what their overall width is there between the screen wall and the back of curb, to whether they could do some adjustments there and get that to work out.
To
Or
move,
not.
to move sidewalk inward.
Yeah,
So if they were to move it inward towards the site, it would be adjacent to that CMU wall, which is now only like 3 feet, 3.5 feet tall. But that still might create some kind of shy space.
Yeah, because right now they have a bunch of landscaping before the CMU wall.
Yes.
Which,
yeah.
Yeah, and then in their new proposal that we've kind of tried to work with them on, they have the meandering sidewalk with some landscaping and then just some sidewalk, which I can pull up again.
that just looks like a tree waiting to get hit by a scooter.
And so it's a little bit different than what we, so instead of just a screen wall, what did they do, like a raised planter there? Is that what I'm seeing?
I think that's what I'm understanding is.
Huh. Okay. Yeah, they would have to take it all the way to that raised planter, but that being a raised planter, which still gives you some plantings in the top of that, you know, I mean.
Yeah, I struggle mostly with build it wrong and then ask for forgiveness. And then to the detriment of the general public and the neighborhood, right? We have the criteria for a reason, and we look at it for a reason. And then we expect it to be built that way for a reason.
Yeah, I guess it looks like they've got the 6-foot tree wells there now. So are they waiting to are they waiting to officially submit a modification for consideration, or just trying to get some feedback prior to doing that, or what?
They were hoping that this would be an approval that they could move forward today, where I don't know. I don't think that our administrative review section specifically addresses this necessarily at this point in time.
Like a change to an approval.
Yeah, it's where we have different, what staff is allowed to administer versus not. And they were hoping that this would be it, I know.
Like it would fall under the less than 5% change to where it could possibly be staff level approval, but staff at that point is allowed to bring it to the committee for discussion and an actual approval or denial. That's what I think.
Well, how does staff feel about a detached being approved and an attached being installed?
Ideally, it would have been a nice landscape strip and detached. I think that there is the issue of having to figure out the tree wells in the original approval, that it would come back as a question no matter what. I'm very torn because there's a 7-foot sidewalk versus a 5. And so I don't know on the theory of how that works. Certainly, I appreciate all the work that this city has done, specifically this group, but really trying to make a better public realm by having a comfortable public realm. So I guess there's my non-answer.
And
So
given
they're-
that, go ahead.
I was gonna say, so they're proposing a 7-foot sidewalk?
So what did if we go back to the original, that what I think that landscape buffer must have only been 2 feet because you have it there shown.
Okay, and that just got all paved.
Mhm.
So if that is the case, then they could still have the 2-foot landscape buffer on the other side where it doesn't, on that end going towards Osage, they still could have or could provide that buffer where we don't have the issue with the tree wells.
Correct.
Well, they could provide it everywhere and then just narrow it down to 5 feet around the tree wells, right?
I think, maybe that's the solution, that they cut that out 2 feet. We let them do the bulb out around the tree wells. But then go back to what they had here with the 5-foot and the 2-foot landscape buffer next to the back of curb. So we still have that landscape strip all the way down, but at the tree wells, we let them bulb out the sidewalk around the tree wells
Internally.
internally. Maybe that's it gets them basically back to this scenario with addressing the fact that they didn't have enough room for those tree wells, and the tree wells are going to have to be scooted in and therefore adjusting the sidewalk.
So there's still, it's detached. Tree wells get bigger, sidewalk bulbs to the inside around the tree wells.
So
I-
as, from what you're seeing here, what they proposed would be okay with the additional landscape strip.
Yeah, so basically they'd have to come in there, still put in that landscape strip all along the street. But the sidewalk could bulb inward around those to accommodate the tree wells.
Okay.
And then we only get shy space against that built-in planter, raised planter at the tree wells.
But then allow the sidewalk to go around, so you have the wells. So the wells is still.
The wells still need to be 6 feet. So it's the 6 foot landscape for the tree well, and then everywhere else is like the 2.5 feet.
And then another question, just for my own curiosity, not that the applicant will bring it up, but would there be relief if it's not greenery, if it's some sort of like different treatment? So say they come in and they paint something on that. Probably not.
Painted concrete to be
Yeah.
no.
No, okay.
No.
Live things.
Live things, got it. All right.
Okay, good enough?
One last very sad piece of news. If you haven't heard, Councilmember Beaumont passed away last week.
Oh, whoa.
I didn't know that.
So I'm sorry for the bad news.
Shoot. Well, if you see your family, give her family our best.
Oh, yeah, definitely. That's terrible.
When we know more about funeral arrangements, I can send that out to the committee.
Yeah.
you.
Shoot, sorry to hear that.
Okay, well, I guess, are we adjourned?
We're
Motion.
adjourned at
Perfect. Okay, thank
See
you
you.
very much. Have
See
a
you
good
guys.
evening.
very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a good one.